Consider the moment a person decides to take a different route to work on an ordinary Tuesday morning, a simple choice made without deliberation or conscious weight, perhaps because they noticed traffic on their usual road or felt a subtle inclination toward variety in their commute. On that same Tuesday morning, a delivery truck experiences a mechanical failure on the road they would have normally traveled, a failure that would have resulted in a catastrophic collision had anyone been in that particular spot at that particular moment. The person who changed their route lives, unaware that their arbitrary decision had intersected with the laws of physics and probability in a way that preserved their existence. Meanwhile, across the city, another person boards a flight they booked months in advance, a flight that experiences severe turbulence but ultimately lands safely. Yet the person sitting 3 rows behind them suffers a sudden undiagnosed cardiac event during descent and dies while surrounded by hundreds of people traveling to the same destination. The randomness of death operates on a scale so vast and interconnected that it becomes almost incomprehensible when examined closely. A person can spend decades avoiding obvious risks, never smoking, exercising regularly, maintaining perfect health metrics, eating with meticulous care, and still be struck by a vehicle driven by someone checking their phone at an intersection they had no reason to cross at that exact moment. Another person can engage in behaviors that statistically should result in their demise, surviving decades of recklessness through what appears to be pure chance, their biology and circumstance aligning in ways that contradict probability itself. The mechanisms behind this randomness are fundamentally rooted in the complexity of causation and the astronomical number of variables that determine whether a person lives or dies on any given day. Our bodies contain billions of cells that could malfunction, creating cascading failures that we cannot predict or prevent. The physical world around us contains countless moving objects, chemical reactions, and environmental factors that intersect with our presence in ways we cannot control or foresee. Other people's decisions, mistakes, and choices create ripples that extend outward, potentially affecting whether we are in a particular location at a particular time, and therefore whether we encounter danger or safety. The universe does not prioritize good people over bad people, the young over the old, or the careful over the careless when death arrives, yet we have constructed elaborate psychological frameworks to believe otherwise. We tell ourselves that if we follow the rules, eat correctly, exercise regularly, see doctors for checkups, and avoid obvious dangers, we can somehow negotiate with death itself, bargain with probability, as though our virtue or prudence creates an invisible shield that keeps the random at bay. This belief persists despite overwhelming evidence that it is fundamentally false, that death arrives for the conscientious and the reckless alike, for those who prepared and those who did not, for those who deserved more time and those whose time was never meant to be long. We continue to behave as though our actions create a reliable shield against randomness, not because evidence supports this belief, but because the alternative, the genuine confrontation with the arbitrary nature of our existence and cessation, produces a form of psychological distress that most people cannot sustain for extended periods. Therefore, we normalize the illusion of control, the comforting fiction that death is something we can prevent or postpone through the right choices, even as we witness daily examples of people dying despite having made all the right choices, and people surviving despite having made seemingly every wrong one. This contradiction between what we know to be true and what we choose to believe represents one of the most fundamental coping mechanisms of human consciousness, a necessary delusion that allows us to wake each morning and engage with life as though our present's Tom. Consider the vast majority of moments you have experienced throughout your entire life, every conversation you have had, every place you have visited, every person you have encountered in passing, every meal you have eaten, every thought that crossed your mind in the shower, every drive to work, every time you felt a particular emotion that seemed so vivid and real in that moment. The overwhelming reality is that virtually all of it has been completely forgotten, erased from existence as thoroughly as if it never happened at all. You cannot recall what you wore 3 weeks ago on a random Tuesday, or what you ate for lunch on the 5th of last month, or the specific words someone said to you in a conversation that felt important at the time. This is not a failure of memory, but rather the default setting of human consciousness, a systematic and absolute forgetting that affects every person equally and without exception. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon stems from the brain's fundamental design limitation. human memory is not a video recorder capturing every moment with perfect fidelity. Instead, it is a highly selective filtering system that prioritizes information deemed relevant for survival, reproduction, and social bonding, while discarding everything else as neurological waste. The hippocampus, the brain structure responsible for consolidating memories, literally cannot encode the totality of your experience. It must choose what matters and what does not, and by design, considers most of your life utterly unmemorable. What makes this truly disturbing is not the mechanism itself, but rather our complete denial of its implications. We live as though our lives matter in their totality, as though the accumulation of daily moments creates something permanent and meaningful, yet we simultaneously know with absolute certainty that we will forget almost everything. We take photographs to prove that moments happened, we write in journals to preserve thoughts, we tell stories to keep memories alive, all while knowing these are merely thin veneers over the inexorable tide of forgetting. We have accepted this cosmic erasure so completely that we no longer notice it at all. The people you knew decades ago have largely been forgotten, their faces fading into abstraction, their voices impossible to recall. The version of yourself that existed 10 years ago is gone, replaced by a different person whose thoughts and fears and daily concerns you can barely access. Entire years pass into a blur in retrospect, compressed into a few vivid snapshots and nothing more. Yet we continue to live as though continuity exists, as though we are the same person we always were, as though the moments of today will matter tomorrow in ways that justify the energy we expend to create them. We have normalized the impossible contradiction that we are simultaneously creatures of profound experience and creatures of profound forgetting, never quite reconciling that we are always actively becoming ghosts to our own pasts. Perhaps this is why we fear death so intensely, not because existence ends, but because we realize it has already ended countless times before, each forgotten moment a small death we did not mourn. The terrifying truth is that no one remembers you as fully as you remember yourself, and even you are forgetting yourself constantly. In a year, no one will remember what you said in this moment. In a decade, the people closest to you will have forgotten most of the conversations that felt most essential to your existence. The world will continue turning, indifferent to the specificity of your inner life, and you will become, to nearly everyone, simply a name attached to a few anecdotes that grow less accurate with each telling. And yet, despite this knowledge, we continue to speak as though being remembered matters, crafting legacies and accomplishments as though they will endure, when the historical record itself is merely a selection of shadows. A few names and dates that survive the filtering, while billions of lives disappear into the unmarked vastness of time, leaving no trace at all. Consider the fundamental reality of existence that we encounter every single moment of every single day. Time moves forward without pause, without mercy, without exception, and without any ability for us to slow it down, speed it up, or reverse its direction in any meaningful way. Right now, as you listen to these words, seconds are passing that you will never get back, moments are disappearing into the past that cannot be recovered or relived, and your life is becoming shorter with each breath you take and each heartbeat that occurs in your chest. This is not a metaphor or philosophical concept, but rather an inescapable physical reality that governs every aspect of human existence, from the moment we are born until the moment we cease to exist entirely. You cannot negotiate with time, cannot bargain with it, cannot ask for extensions or second chances in any way that actually works, and yet we spend most of our lives behaving as though we have infinite amounts of it stretching before us into an indefinite future. The mechanism behind this relentless forward motion is rooted in the fundamental structure of the universe itself, in the laws of thermodynamics and entropy that ensure all things move from order toward disorder, that all energy disperses, and that all moments are irreversible. Every second that passes is genuinely gone, not paused somewhere waiting to be accessed again, but permanently consigned to history where it cannot be touched or altered or recovered. Our brains understand this intellectually, yet they evolved in an environment where immediate survival concerns dominated our thinking, where the distant future felt remote and unreal compared to the pressing needs of the present moment. This cognitive bias allowed our ancestors to take risks, to pursue short-term gains, to ignore the ticking clock of mortality in favor of immediate reproduction and survival. And these same patterns persist in our modern minds despite the radical differences in our circumstances. We know with absolute certainty that time never stops, that every day that passes brings us closer to the end of our existence. that the years are accelerating as we get older because each year becomes a smaller percentage of our total lifespan. And yet we continue to postpone the things that matter, to delay the experiences we claim to value, to wait for some future moment when conditions will be perfect and we will finally be ready. The normalization of this pattern is so complete that we have built our entire society around the assumption that tomorrow will arrive and be substantially similar to today, that we will have time later to do the things we want to do, that death is something that happens to other people, or at least not to us in any immediate or pressing way. We spend decades in education preparing for life rather than living it. We work jobs that slowly drain our spirits in exchange for money we plan to use during some nebulous retirement period that may never come. And we sacrifice the present for a future that grows closer with each passing moment, but somehow never seems to arrive as the moment we were promised it would be. The cruel irony is that the only moment we ever actually possess is the one happening right now, the present instant that is already disappearing as we recognize it, and yet this is the moment we most often spend lost in thoughts about a past we cannot change or a future we cannot guarantee, squandering the only thing we actually have in pursuit of things we may never reach. The paradox deepens when we recognize that awareness of time's relentless passage does not actually change our behavior. We can understand intellectually that every moment is finite and irreplaceable, yet this knowledge rarely translates into the fundamental shift in priorities that logic would suggest it should, leaving us trapped between what we know and what we do. We witness this disconnect most clearly in moments of crisis or loss, when time's passage suddenly becomes undeniable and we desperately wish we had spent our finite hours differently, yet even these wake-up calls fade as our minds return to their default path. We begin with a scene that plays out in countless homes across the world, in quiet moments and desperate conversations, where two people sit across from each other and acknowledge a truth they have been avoiding for months or even years. They love each other, but they cannot stay together. A woman lies awake at night, thinking about the man she married, the one who makes her laugh and holds her when she cries, yet she knows that something fundamental is missing, some essential compatibility that no amount of affection can bridge. A man realizes that despite feeling genuine love for his partner, they want different things from life. They envision futures that cannot coexist, and love alone cannot compress two incompatible visions into one shared reality. These are not stories of betrayal or cruelty or infidelity, but rather something more unsettling, the recognition that love, that force we have been taught since childhood is the answer to everything, is actually insufficient. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is straightforward when examined clearly, yet we spend decades resisting this understanding. Love is an emotional state, a neurochemical experience that creates attachment, vulnerability, and desire for another person's well-being, but it operates in only one dimension of human relationship. A partnership requires alignment across numerous planes: financial compatibility, life goals, value systems, communication styles, sexual frequency and preference, desired location, family planning decisions, career ambitions, personality types, conflict resolution methods, and 100 other practical realities that exist entirely outside the domain of emotional love. Two people can be deeply in love while disagreeing about whether to have children, whether to relocate, how to spend money, what religion means to them, how much time to spend with extended family, or whether their basic daily rhythms and social needs are compatible. Love cannot manufacture agreement where there is fundamental difference. It cannot silence the resentment that builds when core needs remain unmet, and it cannot override the quiet despair of knowing you are with someone who loves you but cannot give you what you actually need. What makes this truth particularly disturbing is how thoroughly our culture has normalized the idea that love should be enough, that if two people truly love each other, they can overcome any obstacle, solve any problem, and build a lasting life together. This narrative pervades our movies and songs, our literature and advice columns, and it creates a particular kind of suffering for those who discover that they have fallen into the terrible position of loving someone they cannot actually build a life with. People remain in relationships far longer than they should because they cannot reconcile the presence of genuine love with the absence of compatibility, believing that the love itself should be enough to make everything else work out. Others leave relationships and carry guilt and grief, wondering if they made a mistake, if perhaps love should have been sufficient, if they were simply not committed enough or patient enough or willing enough to make it work. We have constructed a mythology around love that asks it to perform functions it was never designed to perform, and then we are shocked and disappointed when it fails to do so. The persistence of this belief, despite its logical inconsistency, suggests something deeper about human psychology. We want love to be enough because the alternative is too difficult to contemplate, because accepting that love is insufficient requires us to make hard choices, to leave situations that feel good in one way even if they are wrong in others, and to accept that sometimes there is no villain in the story, just incompatibility. We normalize this false promise because it is comforting, because believing in the redemptive power of love feels better than accepting its limits, and because acknowledging these limits forces us to take responsibility for our own lives rather than trusting that the right emotion will solve everything. From the moment you are born, your parents begin a journey toward their own mortality, a biological certainty that most people acknowledge intellectually but rarely confront with genuine emotional preparation. Your mother and father, the two people who brought you into existence and spent countless hours ensuring your survival, feeding you through your earliest years, teaching you how to navigate the world, holding you when you were afraid, will eventually stop existing. This is not a metaphor or a philosophical abstraction, but a literal fact about the passage of time and the human body's inevitable decline. Every parent ages in real time, their hair graying, their skin changing texture, their movements becoming slower and more deliberate, yet somehow we move through our days pretending this visible transformation is not occurring at all, or that it will happen far in the future, in some abstract time that feels perpetually distant from our current moment. When you are young, your parents seem almost ageless, almost superhuman in their ability to solve problems and provide for you, and this creates a cognitive distortion where their eventual death feels like an impossibility rather than a mathematical certainty. The psychological mechanism behind this denial is partly rooted in survival itself, because if we truly internalized from childhood that our primary caregivers would one day cease to exist, the anxiety would be paralyzing and potentially damaging to our development. Our minds therefore create a kind of temporal buffer zone, allowing us to know this truth while simultaneously not knowing it, holding both beliefs in a state of uncomfortable suspension that we rarely examine directly. But this suspension inevitably breaks. A phone call comes, or a diagnosis is delivered, or you notice one parent struggling to open a jar that they once opened effortlessly, and suddenly the abstract becomes concrete, the distant future collapses into the present moment, and you are forced to recognize that the countdown was always happening, silently, in the background of every ordinary day you took for granted. And in that moment, you understand that all the time you spent waiting for them to need you less, or for yourself to become independent enough to stop needing them, was time stolen from simply being with them as they were, not as the invincible figures of your childhood, but as aging people moving through their final years, deserving of the same patient attention they once gave to you. The conversation you avoid having, the visit you postpone because you are busy, the call you intend to make but never do, these become the primary regrets people carry, not because they failed to accomplish anything grand, but because they failed to show up for the ordinary, irreplaceable moments that were always finite, always numbered, always running out. This is the difficult mercy of knowing. It gives you the chance, however you choose to use it, to change how the remaining time unfolds. You might call them more often. You might listen without planning your response. You might ask them questions about their own lives, their own regrets, their own dreams, the parts of them that exist beyond their role as your parent. Or you might do none of these things and carry that knowledge forward as a weight, a missed opportunity that sharpens with each passing year until finally there is no time left to change course. When that day finally arrives, you will discover that grief is not a single moment of devastation, but an endless series of small shocks, reaching for the phone to call them, setting the table with an extra plate out of habit, hearing a song they loved and forgetting, for just a second, that they cannot hear it anymore. And you will understand, too late for it to matter, that the only real preparation for their death was never about accepting the inevitability of it, but about having loved them well while they were still here to receive it. There exists a peculiar mathematics to human existence, one where time moves in only a single direction, and yet we spend much of our lives behaving as though it does not. When you are young, the future seems infinite and the present moment feels disposable, something to be rushed through in pursuit of some distant milestone that promises to contain all the meaning and satisfaction your life requires. You believe that happiness exists in a future state, after you finish school, after you get the job, after you meet the right person, after you achieve financial security, and so the present moment is treated as merely a tunnel to pass through rather than a space to inhabit. The specific tragedy of youth is not that it is fleeting, though it certainly is, but that we are physiologically and psychologically incapable of recognizing its value while we possess it. A teenager with perfect skin and boundless energy and decades of potential ahead looks in the mirror and sees only flaws and limitations. An adult in their 20s with freedom and mobility and time they will never have again spends it worrying about things they cannot control. The body during youth is a remarkable instrument of capability, yet the young mind is typically too anxious or distracted or convinced of impending transformation to truly appreciate this gift. The mechanism behind this phenomenon operates on several levels simultaneously. First, there is the neurological reality that the human brain does not finish developing until the mid-20s, which means young people are literally not equipped with the full capacity for long-term thinking and consequence evaluation that would allow them to properly value their current state. Second, there is the social conditioning that tells young people their value is determined by their future potential rather than their present reality, creating a perpetual postponement of satisfaction. Third, there is the simple fact that you cannot fully appreciate something you have never lost, and youth is lost so gradually that by the time it is truly gone, the loss feels inevitable and permanent in a way that makes retrospective longing feel futile. What persists as perhaps the most disturbing element of this truth is that despite its complete predictability, despite the fact that virtually every person who has aged beyond youth has reported this exact realization with remarkable consistency, young people continue to squander the very thing that their predecessors desperately wish they could reclaim. There is no logical reason for this pattern to repeat across generations, and yet it does, with near universal regularity. We have normalized the notion that youth is wasted on the young, as though this is some acceptable law of nature rather than a tragic synchronization of ignorance and biology. The opportunity cost is staggering when you actually pause to consider it, yet the consideration itself is precisely what youth prevents, creating a locked loop that seems almost deliberately designed to extract the maximum amount of regret from the human experience. And so we arrive at middle age, or older still, suddenly aware that the infinite future has become noticeably finite, that the tunnel has opened onto a landscape we can now see the far edge of, and the only thing we can do with this hard-won clarity is apply it to a life that has already been largely constructed around the absence of it. We can offer advice to the young, frame it in the most compelling language we possess, but we cannot transfer the felt understanding that would make them actually hear it, that knowledge lives only in the territory of lived experience, and the map we draw from our own journey simply cannot substitute for the walk itself. Perhaps this is why the most piercing moments of middle age come not from dramatic loss, but from small encounters, catching your reflection in a window and being startled by unfamiliar lines, realizing you can no longer do something that once felt effortless, noticing that the people around you have begun to treat you differently, as though a switch has been quietly flipped. Consider the moment when you realize you have made a choice that cannot be undone, when the weight of that decision settles into your chest like a stone that will never be removed, and you understand with absolute clarity that no amount of time passing or success in other areas of your life will ever fully erase what you have done or failed to do. This is the nature of regret, and it operates with a permanence that defies our intuitive sense of how human psychology should work. When you make a mistake, when you choose poorly, when you fail to act at a critical moment, something fundamental shifts inside your consciousness, and that shift does not simply fade away like a fading dream upon waking. The memory may become less vivid, the emotional intensity may diminish over years or decades, but the regret itself persists in a strange, suspended state, waiting to resurface at unexpected moments when you encounter a similar situation, or when you see someone else thriving in the path you abandoned. The mechanism behind this permanence is rooted in how human memory works, how our brains are designed to learn from mistakes by encoding them deeply and making them difficult to access and suppress, because evolutionarily speaking, forgetting that touching fire causes pain would be catastrophically disadvantageous. But regret goes deeper than simple cautionary memory, because regret is not merely about learning what not to do. It is about the crystallization of a parallel life that never happened, the calcification of what could have been into a permanent alternate reality that exists only in your mind. When you regret not pursuing a relationship, not taking a job opportunity, not speaking up in a moment that mattered, you are not just remembering an event. You are mourning an entire life you will never live, and that mourning does not conclude like grief does, because you are grieving something that never existed and therefore cannot ever be properly acknowledged or buried. Years pass and you may convince yourself that you have moved on, that you have accepted your choices and made peace with the roads not taken, yet something triggers the memory, and suddenly you are standing in that moment again, feeling the same weight, the same ache, the same sense of permanent loss, as if no time has passed at all. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of regret, its resistance to the healing power of time. We are told that time heals all wounds, that with enough distance we will gain perspective and acceptance, and to some degree this is true for trauma and grief and acute pain, but regret seems to operate outside this natural progression of emotional recovery. The regret you felt at 20 about a choice made at 18 will visit you again at 40, at 60, at 80, unchanged in its essential character, merely wearing different clothes and approaching from different angles. We have normalized this permanence so completely that we rarely question it, accepting it as simply part of the human condition, the price we pay for being creatures capable of contemplating what might have been. Yet this acceptance does not make it any less disturbing when you truly sit with the implications. You are moving forward through your life, building things, achieving things, creating new memories and new joys, yet underneath it all, those regrets remain embedded like fossils in the strata of your consciousness. Never decomposing, never truly resolving, simply becoming deeper and more established with the passage of time. And perhaps the cruelest irony is that the very act of trying to move past a regret, of attempting to prove to yourself that it no longer matters, only serves to reinforce its permanence by demanding that you continue to think about it, to measure yourself against it, to wonder endlessly whether you might have been happier or more fulfilled had you chosen differently. So you carry forward two lives simultaneously, the one you are actually living and the one you will never stop imagining, each constantly measuring itself against the other. Consider the fundamental isolation that exists at the core of human consciousness, the peculiar and inescapable reality that what happens inside your mind remains forever locked away from the direct experience of another person, no matter how close they are to you or how desperately they attempt to bridge that gap. When you describe your childhood trauma to a therapist, they are not experiencing what you experienced. They are constructing an approximation based on your words, filtered through their own neural architecture and their own history of pain. When you try to explain to your partner why you felt hurt by something they said, you are translating an internal emotional state that has no exact vocabulary into language, and in that translation, something fundamental is always lost. Your closest friend, the person who knows you better than almost anyone else on earth, will never truly inhabit your perspective, will never feel your specific combination of fears and desires and memories the way you do, because consciousness appears to be an inherently private phenomenon. Even identical twins who share genetics and early environments develop separate subjective worlds that diverge further with each passing year and each unique experience that only one of them lives through. This is not a failure of communication or empathy, though those things matter greatly. Rather, it is a structural feature of how consciousness itself appears to work, an architectural limitation built into the human condition. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates on several levels simultaneously. Neurologically, each human brain is unique in its organization, its patterns of connectivity, its chemical balance, and the specific way it has been sculpted by individual experience, meaning that even when two people encounter identical stimuli, the neural processing that occurs will differ in subtle but profound ways. Linguistically, we attempt to compress the vast complexity of subjective experience into words that are imprecise by their very nature, symbols that refer to concepts, but can never fully capture the qualitative texture of lived experience. Epistemologically, there exists what philosophers call the problem of other minds, the logical puzzle that we can never directly access another's consciousness, and can only infer its existence through their behavior and reports, creating a permanent gap between our knowledge of others and our knowledge of ourselves. When someone tells you they understand how you feel, what they mean is that they have felt something similar enough in their own life that they can project themselves into an approximate version of your experience. But this approximation, no matter how close it comes, is still fundamentally a model, a working hypothesis rather than genuine shared experience. And yet we live as though this barrier does not exist, as though understanding between people is actually possible in some complete sense, as though love and friendship and professional relationships can bridge this gap. We create entire industries around the promise of being understood, from therapy to coaching to life counseling to spirituality, all predicated on the idea that if we just find the right words, the right framework, the right person, genuine understanding will finally occur. We spend hours in conversation attempting to make ourselves known to others, to ensure that they truly get us, to feel less alone in our internal worlds, and we measure the quality of our relationships partly by how well we feel understood by the people in them. We construct our identities partly around the narrative we tell others about ourselves, investing effort into making sure that the external presentation of who we are matches the internal reality of who we actually are, driven by a deep need to be truly seen and comprehended. Yet this striving for understanding persists in the face of the logical impossibility of its complete achievement, a paradox we do not question and have perhaps even built our social structures around, because the alternative, the acceptance that we are all ultimately alone in our sub. Consider the paradox of modern connection. We live in an era of unprecedented technological ability to reach one another, yet the experience of profound isolation has become one of the defining psychological conditions of our time, affecting not only those who are physically alone, but also those surrounded by countless others in crowded cities and bustling social networks. The loneliness that characterizes contemporary existence is not merely the absence of people, but rather a fundamental disconnection between what we present to the world and what we actually experience internally, a gap that widens with every curated social media post, every professional interaction filtered through workplace formality, and every casual conversation where we remain carefully guarded about our deepest fears and uncertainties. To understand why loneliness is not simply a temporary state, but an inevitable condition of human existence, we must examine the basic structural reality of consciousness itself. Each mind is fundamentally isolated within its own subjective experience, unable to truly merge with or fully access another person's internal world, and despite our best efforts at communication and connection, we are always translating our interior lives into language and behavior that can never completely capture the full texture of what we actually feel and think. This isolation at the level of consciousness is compounded by the modern social structure, which encourages us to compete rather than truly collaborate, to perform rather than authentically share, and to accumulate connections as status symbols rather than as genuine relationships built on vulnerability and mutual understanding. Even in our most intimate relationships, we discover that there remains an irreducible distance between ourselves and another person, a realm of private experience and thought that no amount of intimacy can fully bridge. And as we progress through life and accumulate secrets, traumas, embarrassments, and peculiar thoughts that we believe are too strange or shameful to share, this loneliness deepens despite, or perhaps because of, our increased connection to others. We have normalized this condition so thoroughly that we have created elaborate psychological defenses against acknowledging it, treating loneliness as a personal failure rather than a universal human condition, blaming ourselves for not having enough friends or not being social enough, when in fact the structure of human consciousness and modern society has made a degree of loneliness not just possible, but inevitable for virtually everyone. The recognition of this inevitability, paradoxically, offers a strange kind of relief, not the false comfort of toxic positivity that promises we can solve loneliness through self-improvement, but rather the honest acknowledgement that the ache we feel is not a personal deficiency, but a shared human condition that connects us to every person who has ever lived and wondered if anyone truly understands them. In this shared recognition of inevitable loneliness lies the possibility of genuine compassion, not the performative kind we display on social media, but the quiet understanding that everyone around us is struggling with the same fundamental isolation, and that perhaps the most honest form of connection is simply acknowledging, without trying to fix, that we are all quietly alone together. This is why the deepest moments of human connection often occur not when we successfully bridge the gap between ourselves and others, but when we sit together in the acknowledgement that the gap exists and cannot be closed. When we stop pretending that perfect understanding is possible and instead find solace in the presence of another person who is equally aware of their own irreducible isolation, equally struggling with the weight of their private consciousness, and equally grateful for the brief respite that comes from being witnessed in our fundamental aloneness. There exists a peculiar phenomenon that haunts the lives of those who have achieved what they once desperately wanted, a hollow echo that follows every milestone crossed and every goal accomplished. And this phenomenon manifests as a fundamental disconnect between the promise of achievement and the reality of having achieved it. When someone finally obtains the job they spent years pursuing, they discover within weeks that the initial euphoria evaporates entirely, replaced by a new baseline of normalcy that feels remarkably similar to their previous state of wanting, except now the wanting has shifted targets and intensified in its urgency. The promotion arrives, the salary increases dramatically, the business succeeds beyond projections, yet the person stands in their new office or counts their new wealth with a sense of deflation that seems to betray all logic and reason. What they believed would fundamentally transform their existence instead transforms only their circumstances, leaving their internal landscape largely untouched by external triumph. This occurs because human beings possess a neurological and psychological mechanism called hedonic adaptation, which functions as an invisible reset button in the mind that recalibrates our baseline of satisfaction whenever we acquire something we desired, meaning that what once felt like an impossible dream eventually becomes simply the new normal, the new zero point from which we measure future wants. The brain evolved this way for survival reasons, to never become complacent, to always continue striving, to always identify the next threat or the next resource. But in modern life, this mechanism becomes a treadmill that accelerates constantly without ever arriving anywhere meaningful. Someone who worked 18-hour days, convinced that making $100,000 annually would solve everything achieves that number and immediately begins calculating what 200,000 would feel like. And someone else who sacrificed relationships and health to build a successful company finds themselves equally empty as the struggling entrepreneur they once were, because the achievement itself cannot fill the void that the striving was temporarily masking. What persists despite having no logical reason to persist is our continued belief that the next success will be different, that somehow the fifth achievement will satisfy us in ways that the first four did not, even though every piece of evidence from our own lives and the lives of those around us demonstrates consistently that satisfaction remains always one step ahead, permanently out of reach, like trying to grasp your own shadow. The wealthy executive envies the artist for their freedom, the artist envies the executive for their security, and both envy the person who claims to have found meaning in simplicity, each convinced that the other's life contains the satisfaction their own lacks. This cycle persists because we mistake the problem itself for merely a problem of degree, believing that more of the same thing will finally deliver what less of it could not. We solve for the wrong variable, optimizing endlessly for external markers while the actual source of satisfaction, acceptance of what is, rather than perpetual dissatisfaction with what isn't, remains invisible to us, hidden not by distance but by our refusal to look directly at it. The cruelest irony is that this truth becomes visible only after years of pursuit, when the accumulated evidence finally overwhelms our denial, and by then we have often sacrificed the very things, relationships, health, presence, wonder, that might have actually provided the satisfaction we were chasing all along through achievement. And so we arrive at a peculiar wisdom that comes too late for most, that the antidote to the hedonic treadmill was never more achievement, but rather the deliberate cultivation of gratitude for what already exists, a practice so simple it seems almost offensive in its ordinariness, yet one that requires abandoning the very ambition that built our success in the first place. Consider the moment a child asks a parent why their sibling received a larger portion of dessert, or why one child was allowed to stay up later than the other, and the parent responds that life simply isn't fair. This exchange encapsulates one of the most fundamental truths that we spend our entire lives trying to deny, which is that fairness is not an inherent property of existence, but rather a concept we have invented to comfort ourselves. When we examine the actual distribution of resources, opportunities, and outcomes across humanity, we find patterns of profound and systematic inequality that bear no relationship whatsoever to merit, effort, or moral worthiness. A child born into poverty in a developing nation faces entirely different life circumstances than a child born into wealth in a developed country, and no amount of hard work on the part of the impoverished child will erase the vast advantages the wealthy child possesses from birth. The mechanisms that perpetuate these inequalities operate beneath the surface of our awareness, embedded in institutional structures, historical circumstances, genetic inheritance, and simple randomness. Someone born with a genetic predisposition toward intelligence, athleticism, or good health possesses advantages that nothing they did in their own lifetime earned them, Yet we treat these individuals as if they deserve their success through some merit of their own character. Meanwhile, talented individuals born in regions ravaged by conflict, disease, or economic collapse often live their entire lives without ever accessing the platforms or resources necessary to demonstrate their abilities, and we never even learn their names. The psychological mechanism that keeps us invested in the myth of fairness is our profound need to believe that the world operates according to comprehensible rules, that our position within society reflects our choices and character, and that the outcomes we experience are somehow deserved. This belief provides immense comfort because it suggests that if we work hard enough, stay pure enough, or think positively enough, we can control our destinies and ensure that we are treated justly. Yet every single day, the world provides overwhelming evidence that this is simply not how things work. People die in accidents they could never have predicted or prevented, individuals develop illnesses through no fault of their own, economies collapse due to forces beyond personal control, and entire populations suffer from circumstances determined by geography and history rather than by their own actions. We have somehow normalized this contradiction by creating elaborate systems of meritocracy and justice that pretend to be fair while operating within contexts of profound pre-existing inequality. And we tell ourselves and our children comforting stories about how fairness is possible if we just work hard enough, follow the rules well enough, and believe strongly enough in its existence. The tragedy is not merely that fairness doesn't exist, but that we have constructed entire moral and legal systems that depend upon the fiction that it does, punishing those who fail to succeed within rigged systems as if they simply didn't try hard enough, while rewarding the fortunate as if they somehow earned their advantages through virtue rather than accident of birth. We see this most starkly in our criminal justice systems, where poverty itself becomes a crime, where defendants who can afford excellent lawyers walk free, while those who cannot afford adequate representation receive decades in prison for similar offenses, and where the zip code in which someone is born becomes a more reliable predictor of their incarceration than their actual choices. The uncomfortable truth we must face is that fairness is not something we can achieve through better effort or more virtuous living. It is a concept that has no basis in how the universe actually operates, and perhaps our first step toward wisdom is accepting this rather than exhausting ourselves in the futile pursuit of something that was never real to begin with. Consider the experiences you consider most precious, the moments you believe define who you are, the conversations with people you love that you've replayed countless times in your mind as though they were permanence itself. And understand that right now, in this very moment as you listen to these words, those memories are deteriorating at the cellular level, losing detail and precision with each passing day, each passing hour, each passing second. Until what remains is not a faithful recording of what actually happened, but rather a reconstructed approximation built from fragments and inference and the power of suggestion from external sources. The human brain does not store memories like a video camera storing footage on a hard drive, but rather like a library that is constantly being reorganized, with books being moved to different shelves, passages being rewritten, and entire volumes being lost to the void, so that the memory you access today is not the same memory you will access tomorrow, and by next year it will be fundamentally different in ways you cannot perceive until you compare it with the actual facts of what occurred. Neuroscientists have documented this process extensively, understanding that memory encoding is an active process dependent on proteins and synaptic connections that are inherently unstable, subject to interference and decay, and that each time you recall a memory you actually reconstruct it anew, which means you are not retrieving the original, but creating a slightly altered version influenced by your current emotional state, your current beliefs. The other things you've experienced since that original moment, and the stories other people have told you about what happened. This mechanism exists because the brain prioritizes efficiency over perfect accuracy, and in evolutionary terms it makes sense to remember the general pattern and lesson of an experience rather than every minute detail. Yet this fundamental design flaw means that the person you were 5 years ago, the way you felt, the exact conversation you had, the precise appearance of someone's face, the specific quality of light in a room during an important moment. These things are not being preserved anywhere except in your own deteriorating neural substrate, and when you die, that entire subjective universe of experience vanishes completely as though it never mattered at all. We have built elaborate cultural systems to pretend this is not true, creating photograph albums and written journals and video recordings, Yet these external records are pale substitutes that capture only the surface of experience and not the felt quality of being alive in that moment. And furthermore, we have largely accepted this profound loss as simply part of the human condition, something so natural and inevitable that we rarely speak of it directly. Instead, building monuments and legacy systems and concepts like meaning and purpose, as though these could somehow prevent the inevitable dissolution of everything we have lived through, when in fact every person who has ever existed has watched their own history slowly dissolve into abstraction and vagueness and eventually into complete erasure, and we continue to accumulate experiences and call them memories even knowing that they will not last, even knowing that we are creating nothing permanent. Even knowing that someday our entire lives will be nothing but a handful of disconnected images and emotions with no narrative thread connecting them. And this strange persistence in creating and valuing and organizing, and protecting these temporary neural patterns despite their fundamental impermanence, might be the most honest reflection of what it truly means to be human. Perhaps this is why we tell the same stories repeatedly to those we love, not because we believe we are preserving them, but because in the retelling we temporarily reconstruct them into something vivid and present, transforming the fading memory into a shared experience that exists, however briefly, in the space between us and another person's mind, a mutual acknowledgement that what we have lived through matters precisely. There exists a phenomenon so universal, and yet so quietly devastating that most people experience it multiple times throughout their lives without ever fully acknowledging its gravity, and that is the slow, inevitable drifting apart of friendships that once felt permanent and essential. You meet someone during a formative period of your life, perhaps in childhood or adolescence or young adulthood, and for a stretch of years you are inseparable, sharing secrets and dreams and the kind of vulnerability that feels sacred in its intensity, making plans together and imagining futures where your lives will always remain intertwined in this same way. But then something shifts, almost imperceptibly at first, where the frequency of contact begins to decrease. Messages that once came daily or weekly start arriving monthly, phone calls become less common, and eventually you realize that you have not actually spoken to this person in so long that you have almost become strangers again. Two people who once knew each other completely now reduced to liking each other's social media posts as a hollow gesture of connection. The mechanism driving this dissolution is deceptively simple, rooted in the fundamental truth that human relationships require active maintenance and proximity to survive, and that the circumstances which created the initial bond, whether shared environment or shared age or shared life stage, eventually change as people move through time at different speeds and in different directions. People graduate and relocate to different cities. They get married and develop different friend groups with their spouses. They have children and find their free time consumed by parenting responsibilities. They pursue different career paths that demand different levels of energy and attention. They develop new interests and values that diverge from those they once shared with their old friends. And slowly the common ground upon which the friendship was built becomes smaller and smaller until it nearly disappears. What makes this phenomenon particularly unsettling is how normalized and accepted we have become of it, how we have constructed narratives around it that frame it as merely a natural and inevitable part of growing up, when in reality it represents a profound loss that we are collectively choosing not to grieve or challenge. We speak of friendships ending as though they are inconvenient seasonal changes rather than the death of relationships that once sustained us emotionally and spiritually, and we treat the slow fading of deep connections as just another unremarkable event in the march of time, suggesting that perhaps this persistent dissolution of human bonds is not actually inevitable at all, but rather something we have accepted and embedded into our culture, because resistance would require us to fundamentally reorganize how we live and where we direct our limited time and energy. Perhaps this is why the rare friendship that does endure across decades and distance feels almost miraculous, why we speak of such bonds with a kind of reverent gratitude, because we recognize on some level that maintaining them requires a deliberate choice to prioritize connection over convenience, a daily assertion that some relationships are worth the effort of swimming against the current of our ordinary lives. And yet even knowing this, even understanding intellectually that friendship requires intentional effort, most of us still allow our closest bonds to dissolve without significant resistance, accepting the drift as we accept the seasons, perhaps because the alternative, truly committing to maintain these connections despite all obstacles, would force us to confront uncomfortable truths about our priorities and the choices we have made about how to spend our one finite life. We would have to admit that we chose career advancement over a weekly phone call, that we selected the comfort of our established lives over the vulnerability of reaching out after months of silence, that we permitted the relationship to fade rather than risk the awkwardness of rekindling it. And in doing so, we become complicit in our own loneline. Consider the person who has experienced profound loss, the kind that restructures their entire understanding of what it means to be alive, and you will notice something peculiar about their existence afterward. They move through the world differently, they see things others miss, they possess a kind of wisdom that cannot be taught in any classroom or extracted from any book, because it has been carved into their being through the direct experience of suffering. Pain, in its most fundamental form, is a sculptor, and we are the marble from which it chips away the unnecessary parts of ourselves, leaving behind something that was always meant to be there, but could never have emerged without the pressure, without the breaking, without the unwillingness of our circumstances to let us remain comfortable in our ignorance. When you experience genuine pain, whether it manifests as physical agony or the deeper psychological torment of heartbreak, failure, or loss, your brain undergoes measurable changes, your neural pathways reorganize themselves, your priorities shift in ways both subtle and dramatic, and you find yourself suddenly aware of aspects of human existence that you were previously blind to because you had no reason to see them. The mechanism is straightforward. Pain demands attention. It forces you to confront reality as it actually is rather than as you wish it to be. It strips away the pleasant illusions that most people carry with them throughout their comfortable lives. And in doing so, it leaves you fundamentally altered, incapable of returning to your previous state of naive functioning. We have normalized the idea that growth comes from pain so completely that we rarely stop to acknowledge how strange this truly is. How counterintuitive it seems that our worst experiences should somehow become our greatest teachers. Yet when you observe human beings over time, you cannot deny the pattern. The people who have suffered significantly are almost always more compassionate, more resilient, more genuinely wise than those who have coasted through existence protected from hardship. And somehow we accept this trade-off as if it were simply the nature of things, as if there were no other way to develop depth of character. Yet perhaps this acceptance itself is the problem. We have constructed a world where suffering feels inevitable, where we assume pain is the price of becoming whole, when what we might actually need to examine is whether the shaping itself is what matters, or whether we could find other chisels, other pressures, other ways to carve away our illusions and forge our character without requiring that so many of us break along the way. Perhaps the question we should be asking is not whether pain is necessary, but whether we have the creativity and courage to design lives and societies that develop character through challenge rather than catastrophe, that build wisdom through deliberate struggle rather than enforced suffering, recognizing that the shaping itself, the pressure, the resistance, the requirement to change, might be what truly transforms us, regardless of whether it arrives wrapped in tragedy or intentional difficulty. And in that distinction lies our liberation, the recognition that we need not wait for life to break us in order to become whole, but can instead consciously choose the friction that will shape us through deliberate practice, through relationships that challenge us, through work that demands our growth, so that when we look back on our lives, we see not the scars of wounds we were forced to endure, but the precise contours of a self we deliberately carved into being. This is the paradox we must hold, acknowledging that pain has shaped us profoundly while refusing to glorify it as the only path forward, understanding that the sculptor's chisel works best when wielded by our own conscious hand rather than by the random cruelty of circumstance. And in that understanding, we reclaim both our dignity and our agency, recognizing that the person we become matters far more than the suffering it took to get there. Consider the life of someone who believes they have orchestrated their success through careful planning and disciplined execution, who wakes each morning confident that their choices determine their destiny, who experiences the satisfying sensation of agency as they make decisions throughout their day, yet who remains entirely unaware of the countless variables operating beyond their perception and influence that have shaped every meaningful outcome in their existence. They cannot control the genetic lottery that determined their cognitive abilities, the family they were born into, the economic circumstances of their childhood, the specific moments when they encountered the people who would change their direction, the health of their body on any given day, the cultural moment in which they were raised, or the random timing of opportunities that appeared before them. They attribute their achievements to their own willpower, while remaining blind to how much their willpower itself was shaped by factors entirely outside their control. The brain constructs a narrative of causation and personal agency because it cannot function while simultaneously acknowledging the vast complexity of forces that actually determine outcomes. And this narrative feels so convincing, so experientially real, that we build entire systems of morality, economics, and justice upon the assumption that it is true. We praise people for outcomes that resulted largely from circumstance, while condemning others for circumstances they did nothing to create. And this contradiction persists not because we lack the intellectual capacity to recognize it, but because the human mind requires the sensation of control to maintain psychological stability and motivation. The illusion of control serves a biological function, allowing us to move through the world as though our actions matter in the way we experience them mattering, even though causation operates at a scale far too complex for any individual consciousness to truly comprehend or direct. We have organized societies around the principle that people deserve what they earn and earn what they deserve, yet the evidence for genuine personal control over outcomes grows thinner the more carefully we examine it. And still we maintain this belief not because it is accurate, but because we have built everything upon the assumption that it must be. To release the grip of this illusion requires acknowledging that accepting the limits of control need not diminish our responsibility or effort. It may instead free us from the exhausting demand to explain and justify every outcome as though we were their sole architects, allowing us to act with greater wisdom precisely because we have stopped pretending to understand forces we cannot see. This shift in perspective, from believing we command our circumstances to recognizing ourselves as participants in an incomprehensibly complex system, does not lead to paralysis or nihilism, but rather to a kind of humility that permits genuine adaptation. We can respond more effectively to what actually emerges when we stop insisting that what emerges must conform to our predetermined will. The person who accepts they cannot control the market can invest more wisely. The parent who accepts they cannot control their child's choices can listen more carefully. The activist who accepts they cannot control historical forces can work more strategically within them. Control as illusion is not a counsel of resignation, but an invitation to effectiveness. The paradox resolves itself when we stop asking whether we have control and instead ask what we can actually influence. A question that opens possibility rather than closing it off, because it aligns our efforts with reality rather than expending energy on the impossible demand to be the sole cause of our own existence. The person who grasps this distinction discovers that influence operates most powerfully precisely where control dissolves, in the spaces between intention and outcome, where our actions become seeds scattered into soil we did not prepare and cannot predict, yet where genuine change takes root. Consider the life of someone who has spent decades building what they believe to be an unshakable foundation. A stable job with a respected company, a mortgage paid dutifully each month, savings accumulated with discipline, insurance policies signed to protect against uncertainty, and a retirement plan meticulously calculated to provide decades of comfort. This person has done everything society has instructed them to do, followed every rule, made every recommended choice, and constructed what feels like an impenetrable fortress against the chaos of existence. Yet within a single afternoon, a company restructuring can eliminate their position, a medical diagnosis can consume their savings, a market collapse can erode their investments, or a systemic failure can render their careful plans obsolete. The security they spent their entire adult life assembling dissolves not because they failed to be diligent enough, but because security itself is fundamentally temporary, an illusion we construct to feel safer within an inherently unstable world. The psychological mechanism operating here is profound and nearly universal. Our brains are wired to detect threats and find patterns, and when we successfully create stability in one area of life, we unconsciously begin to treat that stability as a permanent feature rather than a temporary condition. We extrapolate the present into the future, assuming that current circumstances will continue unchanged, that our health will persist, that our relationships will remain intact, that our income will flow continuously, that our possessions will retain value. This cognitive bias serves a practical purpose in allowing us to function without paralyzing fear, yet it simultaneously blinds us to the statistical reality that change is the only genuine constant. What makes this more unsettling is how deeply we have normalized this contradiction in modern society. We build entire systems of thought, institutions, and life strategies around the premise that security can be purchased, earned, or guaranteed, while simultaneously witnessing countless examples of its failure all around us. We watch people lose homes, witness companies collapse overnight, see relationships end unexpectedly, observe health crumble despite careful maintenance, and yet we continue to operate under the assumption that if we just work harder, save more, plan better, or choose the right insurance policy, we can finally achieve permanent security. The reality is that security exists only as a spectrum of temporary conditions, each one temporary in its own way, each one vulnerable to forces both within our control and entirely beyond it. And our continued belief in permanent security persists not because it is logically sound, but because the alternative is too psychologically taxing to maintain consistently. Perhaps the deepest irony is that the moments we feel most secure are often those in which we are most vulnerable to disruption, our confidence itself becoming a blindness that prevents us from recognizing the fragility beneath our constructed certainties. And yet this recognition need not lead to despair. It can instead invite a different relationship with security altogether, one built not on the fantasy of permanence, but on the practice of resilience. Resilience means accepting that loss is not a failure of planning, but an inevitable feature of existence, and learning to rebuild quickly becomes more valuable than the futile attempt to build something that never breaks. When we stop demanding that security be permanent, and instead ask how we might remain flexible, resourceful, and connected to others when disruption arrives, as it inevitably will, we transform our relationship with uncertainty from one of denial into one of honest preparation. This shift from denial to acceptance is not pessimism, but rather a mature acknowledgement of reality, the same clarity that allows a sailor to navigate storms safely rather than pretend they will never occur. Consider the vast majority of human beings walking through their lives with a persistent, gnawing sense of inadequacy, as though they are perpetually falling short of some invisible standard that exists only in their minds, and this standard is so deeply embedded in their consciousness that they often cannot remember a time when they were not measuring themselves against it. We watch parents criticize their children for bringing home an A- instead of an A. We observe artists destroying their work because a single brushstroke falls outside their mental blueprint of how it should appear. We see athletes consume themselves with regret over performances that by any objective measure were extraordinary, and we experience ourselves the crushing weight of knowing that no matter how much we accomplish or how carefully we construct our lives, there will always be some gap between what we have achieved and what we believe we should have achieved. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon is deceptively simple. The human brain is fundamentally a pattern matching and prediction machine designed across millions of years of evolution to imagine futures that have not yet occurred, to model what could go wrong, and to strive toward outcomes that would increase survival and status, which means that our minds are naturally inclined to conceive of ideals and to measure ourselves against them. However, these ideals are constructed from a chaotic mixture of social conditioning, cultural messaging, parental expectations, peer comparisons, and media representations, none of which were designed specifically for your individual life, your specific capabilities, your unique circumstances, or the actual laws of physics and human limitation that govern reality. Yet we nonetheless internalize them as though they were objective truths rather than arbitrary frameworks. What makes this particularly insidious is that we have normalized the pursuit of perfection to such an extent that we have stopped questioning whether the entire endeavor makes logical sense. Because everywhere we look in modern society, we encounter the narrative that more is better, that excellence is always achievable through sufficient effort and discipline, that the gap between where you are and where you should be is simply a matter of willpower and dedication, and therefore if you fall short of perfection, the failure belongs to you rather than to the impossibility of the task itself. We celebrate those rare individuals who appear to approach some domain of perfection, the athlete with the flawless technique, the artist whose work seems divinely inspired, the professional who never makes mistakes without acknowledging the survivorship bias inherent in our observation, the thousands of hours of invisible labor, the genetic advantages, the fortunate circumstances, and most crucially, the fact that even these supposedly perfect individuals are absolutely riddled with flaws, insecurities, mistakes, and limitations that the public simply never witnesses. Yet despite understanding this intellectually, despite knowing that perfection is logically impossible, that entropy and imperfection are the natural state of all physical reality, that every single human being who has ever lived has been profoundly flawed and limited, we continue to carry this burden, this exhausting, soul-crushing weight of chasing something that cannot be caught, as though we might be the exception. As though through sheer force of will we might somehow bend reality itself to match the impossible standards we have internalized. And perhaps the cruelest irony is that this pursuit of perfection actively prevents us from experiencing the very things that make life worth living. The messy relationships that deepen through conflict and reconciliation, the creative breakthroughs that emerge from failure and experimentation, the genuine self-knowledge that comes only through accepting our limitations. Because we are too busy measuring ourselves against an imaginary standard to actually inhabit the imperfect reality we are living. There exists within nearly every human being a reservoir of untapped capability, a collection of talents and aptitudes and intellectual resources that remain almost entirely dormant throughout the course of their existence. And this phenomenon is so pervasive, so utterly normalized within our societies, that we have stopped noticing it entirely. We have integrated it into our understanding of how life simply works, as though it were an inevitability rather than a tragedy occurring at an incomprehensible scale. Consider the individual who possesses a genuine gift for music, for the creation of melodies and harmonies that could move people to tears, yet who will spend 40 years in an accounting department, telling themselves that practical concerns necessitate the abandonment of this ability, that bills must be paid and stability must be secured, and so the gift withers, atrophies from disuse until it becomes almost theoretical, a thing that might have been rather than a thing that is. The same pattern repeats across mathematics, across writing, across visual arts, across the capacity for deep thinking and genuine creativity, and across the potential for meaningful human connection that so many people never fully develop because they are too exhausted from their daily obligations, too depleted from the demands of economic survival to invest in relationships that require vulnerability and attention. The psychological mechanism at work here is remarkably straightforward, operating on the principle that immediate necessity always supersedes distant possibility, that the urgent bill always wins its argument against the important dream. And so we construct lives that are fundamentally misaligned with our actual capabilities and desires. We create structures that systematically prevent the full expression of human potential. And then we wonder why so many people report feeling a pervasive sense of incompleteness, a nagging sense that their lives were lived in a minor key when they possessed within them the capacity for something far more resonant. What makes this particularly disturbing is not merely the individual tragedy of wasted lives, though that alone would be sufficient, but rather that we have collectively agreed to treat this as normal, as the expected outcome rather than as a profound failure of our social organization. We celebrate the rare individual who manages to pursue their potential while simultaneously structuring society in ways that make such pursuit practically impossible for the vast majority. We create narratives of inspiration around the few who escape, while leaving the mechanisms of entrapment entirely unexamined and unchallenged. And in doing so, we have normalized a world in which human beings routinely live and die without ever discovering what they were truly capable of becoming. And perhaps most tragically, the individuals themselves come to internalize this failure, to blame themselves for not possessing the superhuman willpower required to pursue their gifts despite systemic opposition, never recognizing that the problem was never their lack of dedication, but rather a society fundamentally organized around the extraction of labor rather than the flourishing of human capability. We see this most clearly in the child who arrives at school curious and eager, full of questions and creative impulses, only to have these qualities systematically discouraged in favor of compliance and standardized performance. And by the time that child reaches adulthood, the questioning has been replaced by acceptance, the creativity by convention, and they move through life as a functional but diminished version of who they might have been, never quite understanding what was lost in the process of their education. The tragedy deepens when we consider that this suppression is not imposed by malevolent forces, but rather emerges organically from systems designed with other priorities in mind: efficiency, measurability, predictability. And so the waste of human potential becomes an invisible byproduct of institutions that were never structured to recognize or nurture the full spectrum of what any end. When you make a significant mistake in life, particularly one that damages someone's trust or causes them considerable harm, the window for redemption closes far more quickly than most people realize. And this harsh reality operates across virtually every domain of human interaction, from professional environments to intimate relationships, to social circles and community standing. Consider the person who betrays a friend's confidence or the professional who makes a costly error at work, or the partner who commits an act of infidelity. And what becomes apparent is that the initial violation creates a permanent alteration in how they are perceived, even if they spend years attempting to demonstrate genuine change and sincere contrition. The moment of transgression becomes the defining narrative, the central story around which all future interactions are filtered, and no matter how much time passes or how authentically someone transforms their behavior, they are forced to carry the weight of that original failure indefinitely. This phenomenon emerges from several interconnected psychological mechanisms that operate largely outside our conscious awareness, beginning with what researchers call the negativity bias, which is the brain's evolved tendency to weight negative information far more heavily than positive information when forming judgments about other people. A single betrayal or serious mistake can outweigh dozens of demonstrations of reliability and trustworthiness, because our ancestors who were cautious about potential threats survived more often than those who readily forgave and forgot, embedding this skeptical, unforgiving tendency deep within our neural architecture. Additionally, once we form an initial judgment about someone, we selectively attend to information that confirms that judgment while actively ignoring or minimizing information that contradicts it, a process called confirmation bias that essentially locks people into the roles we have assigned them. The person who has been labeled unreliable will find that their reliable actions are attributed to external circumstances rather than character change, while unreliable actions are seen as proof that they have reverted to their true nature. Furthermore, human relationships and professional reputations are built on implicit contracts of predictability and safety, and once someone demonstrates that they are capable of violating those contracts, the burden of proof shifts entirely onto them to prove otherwise. But paradoxically, no amount of subsequent behavior can ever fully restore the original certainty that existed before the violation occurred. The trust that once existed was assumed and automatic, but the trust one must rebuild must be consciously maintained and perpetually re-earned, creating an exhausting asymmetry where the person seeking redemption must live in a permanent state of probation. What is particularly striking about this pattern is that it persists despite the fact that it often serves no rational purpose and contradicts our stated values of forgiveness, growth, and human potential. Yet we have normalized this ruthlessness entirely, treating it as simply how human nature works rather than as a choice we're making collectively to deny people the possibility of genuine transformation and new beginnings. The paradox deepens when we consider that we ourselves hope for second chances, that we construct elaborate justifications for our own failures while extending no such generosity to others. And yet we rarely examine this glaring contradiction or ask ourselves whether the harshness we collectively enforce might say more about our own fears than about anyone's actual capacity for genuine change. Perhaps most painfully, this means that the person who has genuinely transformed, who has done the psychological work, made amends, and fundamentally altered their behavior, must accept that they will never fully escape the shadow of their worst moment, and that their redemption, however authentic, may ultimately exist only in their own conscience, while the world continues to see them through the lens of their failure. Trust is perhaps the most fragile currency in human existence, a delicate construct that takes years to build but only moments to destroy. And what makes this particularly disturbing is that we know this truth with complete certainty, yet we continue to extend trust as though we have not learned anything at all. When you place your faith in another person, you are essentially handing them the ability to harm you in ways that are often far more devastating than physical injury, because you have voluntarily made yourself vulnerable in their presence, and vulnerability, by its very nature, means exposure to the possibility of betrayal. The mechanisms that drive trust breaking are both simple and complex simultaneously. A person lies because the truth feels inconvenient, or they act in their own interest when it conflicts with yours, or they simply fail to prioritize your well-being because the human mind is fundamentally self-preserving, and we are all, at the core of our being, looking out for ourselves first. The betrayal happens when someone you believed in prioritizes their comfort over your well-being, when they take the information you shared in confidence and weaponize it, when they make promises they never intended to keep, or when they simply choose another person or another path over the commitment they made to you. What is truly disturbing about this is not merely that trust gets broken, but rather that we possess complete knowledge that it will inevitably happen in various ways throughout our lives. Yet we continue to trust as though the odds are somehow in our favor, as though the people around us are exceptions to the fundamental nature of human self-interest. We watch our parents disappoint us. We experience friendships dissolve over petty disagreements. We see romantic relationships crumble under the weight of infidelity or dishonesty. And we observe colleagues betray professional confidences for personal gain. And still we move forward in our lives, extending our trust to new people with a kind of desperate hope that defies all rational evidence. The normalization of this phenomenon occurs precisely because we have no real alternative. Human existence requires some level of social cooperation and interdependence, which means we cannot function without trusting others to some degree. So we have constructed an entire emotional and social framework that allows us to ignore the statistical likelihood of betrayal in favor of the practical necessity of connection. We tell ourselves stories about good people and bad people, about those we can trust and those we cannot, when in reality everyone is capable of breaking trust under the right circumstances, because everyone faces moments where their own needs seem to outweigh the commitments they have made. The truly unsettling aspect of this is that we continue to be shocked and devastated when trust is broken, as if the outcome were unexpected, when in fact we should expect it as simply another manifestation of human nature that cannot be separated from existence itself. And yet perhaps the cruelest part is that knowing this does nothing to protect us. We cannot inoculate ourselves against betrayal by simply accepting its inevitability, because trust, by definition, requires us to suspend our knowledge of human nature and act as though the person before us might be the exception, even when we know in our bones they probably are not. So we live in a permanent state of cognitive dissonance, simultaneously aware that betrayal is statistically inevitable while emotionally invested in the belief that it won't happen to us. And this contradiction is not a flaw in our psychology, but rather the very mechanism that allows us to form the bonds necessary for survival itself. This paradox becomes even more apparent when we consider that the people who trust most deeply are often those who have been betrayed most thoroughly, as though suffering has taught them nothing except that connection matters more than self-protection, and so they return again and again to the very vulnerability that has wounded them before. There is a particular cruelty in the way that dreams expire, not with the sudden finality of a switch being turned off, but rather through a slow and methodical erosion that can span years or even decades, leaving you perpetually uncertain about whether you have truly abandoned the dream or whether it still exists somewhere in the recesses of your consciousness, waiting to be resurrected. When you're young, your dreams feel invincible and inevitable, as though the universe itself has conspired to guarantee their arrival, and you move through the world with the absolute certainty that your aspirations will materialize simply because you have decided they should. But somewhere along the journey from adolescence into adulthood, the dreams begin to change shape, not disappearing entirely, but rather transforming into something less vibrant, less urgent, less real with each passing year. The mechanism at work here is insidious because it does not announce itself. Instead, it operates through the accumulation of small disappointments, each one barely noticeable in isolation, but devastating in aggregate, each rejection letter or failed audition or year that passes without progress serving as another brick in an invisible wall between you and the dream you once held so close to your heart. You wake up one morning and realize that you have not thought about that cherished aspiration in weeks, and when you do remember it, the feeling of longing has been replaced by something that feels almost like a stranger's regret, something that happened to someone else in a different lifetime. The psychological mechanism behind this slow death is actually quite simple. The brain is fundamentally a prediction machine, and when predictions repeatedly fail to materialize, the brain gradually downweights the likelihood of future success, which is a rational and protective response, but one that ultimately ensures your dreams will never be achieved. What is particularly unsettling is how normalized this process has become in modern society, how we have constructed an entire cultural narrative around the idea that most people should eventually give up on their dreams and settle into something more practical and realistic. We call this growing up, this surrender, this slow erasure of who we once wanted to become, and we have somehow convinced ourselves that it is not a tragedy, but rather a necessary evil, a sign of maturity and wisdom to accept that the world will not bend to our will. Yet somewhere inside, Even as you go through your practical life with your practical job and your practical concerns, the ghost of that old dream lingers, neither fully alive nor fully dead, occasionally surfacing in moments of vulnerability or late-night reflection, a haunting reminder of the person you thought you would be and the distance between that imagined future and the reality you are currently inhabiting. And perhaps the cruelest part is that this lingering ghost prevents you from fully committing to your current reality. You cannot quite embrace what you have because part of you is still mourning what you do not, suspended indefinitely in a state of incomplete grief for a self that never came to be. This half-life of abandoned dreams becomes its own form of suffering, more insidious than the clean pain of a single decisive moment, because it stretches across decades and quietly poisons the ability to ever feel fully present in any moment. The dream that dies slowly does not grant you the mercy of moving on. Instead, it ensures you will always be haunted by the ghost of an alternate self. You find yourself at 35 or 45 or 55, watching someone younger chase the dream you abandoned, and you feel a strange mixture of envy and relief, grateful that you no longer have to carry the weight of hope, yet devastated by the recognition that you have chosen comfort over the possibility of becoming extraordinary. The dream did not die on a specific day. It died on 1,000 small days, each one so ordinary that you barely noticed the light going out. Consider the fundamental architecture of the human body, a system composed of approximately 37 trillion cells that are constantly dividing, replicating, and deteriorating in an endless cycle of renewal and decay that begins the moment we are born and never truly stops until the very end of our existence. Every single day, your cells accumulate microscopic damage from oxidative stress, from the natural byproducts of metabolism, from environmental toxins, from the simple act of living in a world that contains radiation and pollution and countless invisible assaults on our biological integrity. This damage is cumulative and irreversible in nature, meaning that with each passing year, each passing decade, your body becomes progressively less capable of repairing itself, less efficient at fighting infection, less able to recover from injury, and less resilient in the face of the ordinary wear and tear that existence demands of it. Your organs gradually lose their functional capacity as tissues scar and harden and lose their elasticity. Your immune system becomes slower and less discriminating, your bones become brittle, your joints become stiff, your senses become duller, and your cognitive faculties begin their slow, inevitable decline no matter how diligently you exercise or how carefully you eat or how many supplements you consume. What makes this reality particularly striking is the psychological mechanism by which we maintain denial about this universal truth, constructing elaborate narratives around health optimization and preventative medicine, as though these things represent genuine solutions rather than mere delays of an inevitable outcome. We speak of health as something that can be permanently achieved or maintained, rather than acknowledging it as a temporary state of relative equilibrium that grows increasingly difficult to sustain as time moves forward. And we invest tremendous resources into the fantasy that aging and disease are problems that might eventually be solved through the right combination of technology and willpower and consumption of the correct products. The persistence of this denial, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, reveals something fundamental about human consciousness, specifically our remarkable capacity to function while simultaneously knowing things that we cannot psychologically afford to fully acknowledge or internalize. And so we exist in this strange state of half-awareness, where we intellectually understand that health fails, yet behaviorally organize our lives around the premise that it will somehow be different for us. That we will be the exceptions, that our particular circumstances or genetics or dedication will allow us to escape a fate that befalls every human being who has ever lived. This denial is not a personal failing, but rather a necessary psychological adaptation, a useful fiction that permits us to move through our days without being paralyzed by the weight of our own mortality. Yet it also prevents us from organizing our priorities around what might actually matter most during the years we have remaining. If we could somehow sustain the psychological clarity to recognize health's inevitable decline without being crushed by it, we might redirect our finite attention toward relationships, understanding, creative expression, and the cultivation of meaning, the elements that remain accessible even as the body's capacities contract, rather than chasing the mirage of perfect health as though it were the primary determinant of a life well lived. The irony is that this reorientation, away from the pursuit of perfect health and toward what endures, often produces people who appear more vital and engaged than those still trapped in the exhausting optimization cycle, suggesting that acceptance of limitation paradoxically liberates more energy for actual living than denial ever could. A person at peace with their body's inevitable decline frequently reports greater satisfaction than someone perpetually anxious about the next symptom, the next test result, the next threat to their carefully maintained equilibrium. Consider the person who has lost a child, who receives a large inheritance or wins a substantial sum of money, and yet finds themselves sitting alone in an empty house, unable to feel anything but the weight of absence, unable to fill the silence with anything material can offer. Consider the executive who climbs to the peak of financial success, only to find that the anxiety that haunted them in poverty has simply shape-shifted into new forms at the top, becoming the fear of losing what they have accumulated, the paranoia about who wants it from them, the isolation that comes when you cannot trust whether people love you or love your wealth. Money enters the space where healing should happen, and it simply sits there, inert, unable to bridge the gap between what was lost and what remains, unable to resurrect what has died, unable to transform the fundamental wound into something bearable through purchasing power alone. The mechanism at work here is both simple and profoundly ignored. Healing requires transformation of meaning, reconciliation with what cannot be changed, integration of trauma into a new sense of self, and money is fundamentally a tool of external exchange, not internal reconstruction. Money can move you to a better location, but it cannot move you away from your own mind. It can pay for the finest therapists in the world, and yet the actual work of healing, the painful excavation of wounds and the slow rewiring of neural pathways and belief systems, that remains the solitary work of the individual consciousness, utterly indifferent to the balance of any account. Yet we have collectively maintained the strange fiction that enough money might solve this, that the wealthy must surely suffer less, that grief purchased in a penthouse is somehow less acute than grief in a modest apartment, and we watch as billionaires struggle with depression and addiction and emptiness, and still we do not fully accept the truth that these interior landscapes remain unchanged by exterior accumulation. We continue to offer money as the primary response to suffering, building systems where financial compensation is meant to ease bereavement, where buying things is prescribed as remedy for loneliness, where the ultimate measure of care becomes the dollar amount spent, all while the deepest wounds in human experience remain fundamentally beyond the reach of any currency ever invented. And yet we persist in this delusion, not because money is inherently powerful, but because acknowledging its limitations means facing the terrifying truth that some of our deepest needs, to be truly seen, to matter beyond our usefulness, to find meaning in an indifferent universe, cannot be outsourced, purchased, or delegated away, no matter how vast our resources. And so we are left with the paradox of our age, a civilization with unprecedented wealth and unprecedented loneliness, where the most expensive solutions often address only the symptoms, while the disease of disconnection, meaninglessness, and existential isolation spreads untouched through every tax bracket, reminding us that the deepest poverty is not the absence of money, but the absence of purpose, belonging, and genuine human connection that no amount of it can manufacture. We see this most clearly in the wealthy who have everything except what matters, the aging parent with a full staff of caregivers but no one who truly listens, the successful entrepreneur who can afford any experience yet cannot afford to be vulnerable, the heir who possesses the world but cannot possess peace. This is the final reckoning of a money-centered existence, that it optimizes for everything except the things that actually make us human. And so the question we must finally ask ourselves is not how to earn more money, but how to build lives where money occupies its proper place, as a tool for meeting basic needs and enabling opportunity, but never as a substitute for the difficult, unglamorous work of showing up for one another, of sitting with suffering without trying to fix it, of recognizing that the deepest healing happens in moments of genuine presence that cannot be monetized or scaled. Consider the moment you achieve something you have wanted for a long time, perhaps a goal you spent years pursuing or a dream you believed would transform your entire existence once realized. In that instant of achievement, there is indeed a profound sense of satisfaction, a lightness in your chest, a feeling that all the struggle and sacrifice has been worthwhile. Yet within days, sometimes within hours, this sensation begins to diminish with an almost mechanical precision. The promotion you secured no longer feels like an accomplishment, but simply becomes your new normal, your baseline expectation. The relationship you entered with such anticipation and hope settles into the mundane rhythms of daily coexistence. The possession you saved months to acquire sits in your home as an ordinary object, no longer capable of generating the excitement it once promised. This pattern repeats relentlessly throughout a human lifetime, a cycle so predictable that psychological researchers have named it hedonic adaptation, a term that describes our species' remarkable ability to return to a stable baseline of happiness regardless of positive or negative changes in circumstance. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is rooted in how human consciousness evolved to function. Our brains are fundamentally oriented toward survival and threat detection, which means they are exquisitely sensitive to change and deviation from the norm. When something new occurs, whether positive or negative, the nervous system activates and responds with emotional intensity. However, as that new circumstance becomes integrated into your ongoing reality, becomes part of the landscape of your daily existence rather than an aberration from it, your brain gradually ceases to register it as noteworthy. The neural pathways that fire in response to novelty diminish their activity because the brain is extraordinarily efficient and does not waste resources on stimuli that no longer represent meaningful information. This is why the new car in your driveway eventually becomes invisible to you despite its physical presence, why the comfortable home you dreamed of living in eventually feels ordinary, why the person you love and live with becomes furniture in the landscape of your consciousness rather than a source of constant wonder. What makes this truth particularly disturbing is that we persist in believing, despite overwhelming evidence from our own lives, that happiness lies just beyond the next achievement, just waiting in the next accomplishment or acquisition. We construct elaborate narratives about how our lives will be different once we reach certain milestones, imagining that some future state will be fundamentally different from our present state, yet the pattern continues to replicate itself infinitely. We have normalized the pursuit of fleeting moments of satisfaction as the purpose of life itself, building entire economic and social systems around this understanding, even though each individual person, if asked to reflect honestly, can point to numerous examples in their own biography where this principle has demonstrated itself to be true. The goalpost simply moves forward into the distance, perpetually receding, and we continue forward toward it knowing at some level that the contentment we anticipate will follow the same trajectory as all the contentment that came before it, arriving briefly and then dissolving into the unremarkable texture of ordinary existence. Yet there exists a peculiar wisdom in acknowledging this pattern rather than resisting it. Perhaps the pursuit itself, rather than the arrival, contains the only sustainable form of contentment available to us, and in accepting the impermanence of achievement, we free ourselves from the exhausting requirement that happiness remain permanently fixed. This reframing transforms the fleeting nature of happiness from a source of despair into an invitation to presence, to find meaning in the unfolding of experience itself rather than in its conclusion, to appreciate the warmth of achievement in the moment it occurs without demanding that it endure forever, knowing that this act. Consider a person who experienced a moment of profound harm decades ago, something that shattered their sense of safety or broke their trust in the world, and then observe how that single moment continues to ripple through every subsequent year of their existence, how a particular smell can transport them back to that place of terror in an instant, how certain sounds or expressions on someone's face can trigger a cascade of physiological responses that feel entirely involuntary and beyond their control. The trauma does not fade with time the way a normal memory might, becoming softer and less detailed as years accumulate, but rather it seems to calcify into the very structure of how their nervous system operates, embedding itself into the architecture of their body and mind so thoroughly that they can never quite extract it. The neurobiological explanation for this persistence lies in how traumatic experiences create unusually strong neural pathways through the amygdala, the brain's alarm center, which becomes hypervigilant and oversensitized, causing the traumatized person's threat detection system to remain perpetually tuned to danger even in environments that are objectively safe and secure. What once was a survival mechanism that helped them detect and avoid the source of their original harm becomes a permanent fixture, a filter through which all future experiences must pass, and this persistence exists because the brain is fundamentally designed to remember threats with extraordinary clarity and tenacity, prioritizing survival information over comfort or present moment peace. Yet what proves most unsettling is how we have normalized this permanence, how we accept that someone can carry the weight of their worst experiences for the entirety of their lives without ever truly being free of them. How we acknowledge that healing does not mean erasure but merely management, that the goal is not to forget but to coexist with the memory, to slowly reduce its power over us rather than expecting it to vanish entirely. This acceptance of trauma's permanence stands in stark contrast to our assumption that time heals all wounds, that distance and years should eventually render painful experiences harmless. Yet the evidence of human experience consistently contradicts this comfortable belief, revealing instead that some wounds remain open indefinitely, their scarring a permanent alteration of the person we were before they occurred. And perhaps this is why trauma survivors often speak not of recovery but of integration, of learning to carry their history as part of their identity rather than as a burden that might someday be set down, understanding that the person they have become, cautious, hyper-aware, sometimes fragile, is inseparable from what they endured, making forgetting not a mercy, but an impossibility they have learned to accept. The scars become landmarks in the geography of their self, reference points that orient them toward caution or compassion. And in this way, the trauma that once felt like pure destruction transforms into something more complex, not healed, but woven into the fabric of who they are, a permanent alteration that they learn, slowly and with great difficulty, to carry forward into each new day. And in this acceptance lies a paradox. The very act of integrating trauma, of refusing to wish it away or pretend it never shaped them, becomes the closest thing trauma survivors have to freedom, not freedom from the past, but freedom to move forward while carrying it, to build lives that acknowledge rather than deny the permanent alteration that has occurred within them. This is why a trauma survivor's resilience is not measured in their return to who they once were, but in their capacity to construct meaning from destruction, to look at the person they have become and recognize not just damage, but also an unexpected depth, a hard-won wisdom about suffering that cannot be unlearned and perhaps cannot be achieved any other way. We spend much of our lives waiting for closure, that mythical moment when everything suddenly makes sense, when loose ends tie themselves up neatly, when we finally understand why something happened and can move forward unburdened. We wait for the apology that never comes, for the explanation that would make the pain retroactively bearable, for the phone call or letter or chance encounter that would reframe everything we've endured into something meaningful. A relationship ends not with a conversation but with silence, leaving us to construct our own narratives about what went wrong, why they left, whether we were ever truly loved at all. A loved one passes away before we could say the things we needed to say, before we could resolve the argument that festered between us for years, before we could hear from their own lips that they were proud of us or that they forgave us. A betrayal occurs, but the person responsible never acknowledges it, never asks for forgiveness, and we're left suspended in a state of incomplete understanding, forced to either accept that our hurt will never be validated or spend decades replaying moments trying to extract meaning from silence. The human mind is constructed in such a way that it desperately seeks narrative completion, that it craves the sense of finality and resolution that allows us to file away an experience and move into the next chapter of our lives. We are storytelling creatures, and an unfinished story becomes a splinter in our consciousness, a place where our attention involuntarily returns no matter how much time passes or how much distance we put between ourselves and the source of our pain. Yet closure is fundamentally an internal process rather than an external event, something that requires the cooperation of multiple people or the intervention of circumstances largely beyond our control, which means that waiting for it from the world is an act of profound vulnerability and dependency. We have somehow built an entire culture around the expectation that if we suffer, someone should acknowledge that suffering and make amends, that if we are wronged, justice or apology will be served, that life should provide us with the narrative satisfaction we crave, even though history and daily experience repeatedly demonstrate that this is simply not how the world operates. Most conflicts end not with resolution but with exhaustion or separation. Most questions go unanswered. Most wounds remain tender long after the person who inflicted them has forgotten about us entirely, and somehow we continue on anyway, learning to live with incompleteness as a basic condition of existence. We learn to carry our unanswered questions like stones in our pockets, growing lighter not because we've found answers, but because we've stopped expecting the world to provide them. And perhaps that acceptance, that willingness to move forward without permission or explanation, is the closest thing to closure we will ever actually find. It is a quieter closure than we imagined, one that arrives not as a revelation but as a gradual softening, a day when we realize we haven't thought about the unanswered question in weeks, and we don't feel compelled to reconstruct the story one more time. We simply let it be incomplete, and in doing so, we finally become complete ourselves. This is not the closure we bargained for, but it is the closure that saves us. The recognition that our lives need not be defined by the moments we cannot resolve, that we are large enough to contain mysteries and still move forward, that the incompleteness itself becomes bearable once we stop treating it as a temporary state we must escape and start accepting it as simply part of what it means to be human. The woman who never heard why her mother stopped calling learns to mother herself. The man who never received the apology from his father learns that he can forgive on behalf of them both, that redemption does not require the presence of the person who failed us, only the willingness to no longer let their absence define the shape of our becoming. Consider the moment when someone wrongs you deeply, when they have broken your trust or caused you genuine harm, and then they look at you with eyes that seem to carry remorse, and they say the words that we have been conditioned since childhood to believe hold some kind of transformative power. I am sorry. In that moment, something peculiar happens in the human experience, a kind of collective agreement that these words, arranged in this particular order, possess the ability to undo what has been done, to reverse time itself, to make whole what has been shattered. Yet if we examine this with even the slightest degree of honesty, we must acknowledge a truth that contradicts everything we have been taught about reconciliation and forgiveness. An apology changes absolutely nothing about what occurred. The harm that was inflicted remains inflicted. The words that were spoken remain spoken. The trust that was broken remains broken in the exact moment it was broken. No utterance of regret, no matter how sincere it appears, no matter how many tears accompany it, can reach backward into the past and alter the reality of what happened. The injury to your psyche, the damage to your sense of safety, the violation of your expectations about how someone should treat you, all of these things persist in their full original form, untouched by any verbal expression of contrition. What an apology actually does, when we strip away the mythology surrounding it, is simply communicate intent. It signals that the person who caused harm would prefer that they had not caused that harm, and that they claim some level of understanding about the impact of their actions. Yet intention and impact are entirely different phenomena, and one does not negate the other simply because they occur in proximity. Someone can sincerely wish they had acted differently while simultaneously having caused exactly the damage they now regret. The apology serves primarily as a social lubricant, a way to manage the awkwardness and tension that naturally arises when one person has harmed another, and it functions as a request, more or less explicit, for the other person to absorb the harm, to file it away, to move forward as though the pain has been sufficiently acknowledged and therefore domesticated. We have constructed an entire emotional and social framework around the idea that verbal acknowledgement of wrongdoing possesses some kind of magical restorative property, when in reality it is merely words, and words are the least powerful tool available to us for actually changing material circumstances. Yet this belief persists with remarkable tenacity across nearly every culture and every relationship dynamic. Parents apologize to children and expect that the apology itself repairs the wound of their negligence or cruelty. Partners apologize to partners and believe that saying sorry creates a pathway back to the trust that has been demolished. Friends apologize and imagine that their regret somehow retroactively changes the nature of their betrayal. We accept apologies in situations where accepting them requires us to pretend that time can flow backward, that harm can be undone through acknowledgement, that the human experience operates according to principles of sympathetic magic, where words possess the power to reshape reality. And perhaps most troubling is that we have normalized this delusion so thoroughly that to reject an apology, to say that words are insufficient to address what has been done, is treated as unreasonable, as evidence of bitterness or an inability to move forward. The person who has been harmed is positioned as the unreasonable party for failing to accept the comfort that words are supposed to provide. The architecture of apology has been constructed in such a way that it benefits the person offering the apology far more than it benefits the person receiving it, allowing the wrongdoer to feel as though they have adequately addressed their transgression, while leaving the harmed person in the position of either accepting the inadequate offering or being labeled as unforgiving. There exists a pervasive myth that has shaped how we understand success and achievement, a myth so deeply embedded in our cultural consciousness that we rarely question it anymore. And that myth is the belief that talent alone is sufficient to carry you toward meaningful accomplishment in life. We tell ourselves stories about the naturally gifted individual who seems to possess some innate ability that separates them from ordinary people, and we watch with fascination as they seemingly effortlessly rise above their peers. Yet when you examine the actual lives of people who have achieved genuine mastery or significant success in any field, what you discover is that talent was merely the starting point, a foundation that required decades of deliberate practice, strategic networking. Relentless self-promotion, opportune timing, financial stability, and often a considerable amount of luck that had nothing to do with ability whatsoever. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is both psychological and systemic in nature. Psychologically, we are drawn to the narrative of talent because it is simpler and more emotionally satisfying than confronting the uncomfortable truth that success requires sustained effort over years or even decades, constant failure and rejection, the ability to endure criticism and maintain motivation despite setbacks, and the capacity to make sacrifices that many people are simply unwilling or unable to make. The talented person becomes a convenient symbol because their existence allows us to either feel inadequate about our own lack of natural gifts, or conversely, to feel superior if we believe ourselves to be naturally gifted, without having to examine whether we possess the discipline, resilience, and social capital necessary to translate that talent into actual achievement. Systemically, talent alone cannot compensate for structural disadvantages such as poverty, lack of access to quality education or mentorship, discrimination based on identity, or the absence of professional networks that open doors to opportunity. A person with extraordinary musical talent born into a family without resources to provide instruments, lessons, or connections to the music industry will almost certainly never become a professional musician, while a moderately talented individual from a wealthy, well-connected family will have exponentially better odds of building a successful career in the same field. We have somehow normalized this contradiction despite its glaring illogic, continuing to praise individual talent while ignoring the vast infrastructure of privilege, timing, and circumstance that determines whether that talent ever becomes visible or valuable to anyone. This is not to diminish the importance of talent itself, but rather to acknowledge that talent functions more like a lottery ticket than a guarantee. It gives you a chance to compete, but only if you also possess the resources, opportunity, and stamina to actually enter the race. The sobering implication is that we have built a society that celebrates the winners of this unequal lottery while blaming those who never get a ticket for their failure to succeed, creating a moral fiction where merit alone determines outcomes and conveniently absolving us of responsibility for the systemic barriers that prevent so many talented individuals from ever having the opportunity to develop their gifts at all. Until we reckon with this reality, that talent without opportunity is merely potential that dies unused, we will continue to misdiagnose the reasons for inequality and miss the chance to build systems that actually allow human potential to flourish across all segments of society, regardless of circumstance of birth. The first step toward that reckoning is acknowledging that when we encounter someone who has made it, we are not witnessing the triumph of talent alone, but rather the convergence of ability, preparation, circumstance, and often invisible advantages. And conversely, when we encounter talent that never flourished, we are witnessing not failure, but loss. There exists a profound disconnect between the narrative we are sold about effort and the reality that unfolds in the actual world, a gap so wide that it has become almost invisible through sheer repetition and cultural reinforcement. We are told that hard work is the engine of success, that dedication and long hours spent laboring toward a goal will inevitably produce the desired outcome, yet the observable truth reveals something far more unsettling. Hard work fails with stunning regularity, and it fails regardless of how sincere the effort or how genuine the commitment. Consider the entrepreneur who works 18-hour days for 5 years, investing their life savings and sacrificing relationships and health, only to watch their business collapse due to market conditions entirely beyond their control, or the talented musician who practices obsessively for decades but never achieves recognition because they were born in the wrong decade or lack the connections that matter more than skill. Or the student who studies with absolute discipline and still fails to gain entry to the institution that would have changed their trajectory, not because they lacked intelligence or effort, but because 10,000 other people worked just as hard with statistically better outcomes. The mechanism underlying this cruel reality is that success is not primarily a function of work, but rather a function of numerous converging factors including timing, luck, privilege, market saturation, economic conditions, who you know, where you were born, what resources were available in your childhood, genetic predispositions, and literally thousands of other variables that exist entirely outside the domain of personal effort. Hard work operates as perhaps one variable among many, and often not even the most important one, yet we have constructed an entire civilization around the belief that it should be sufficient, that dedication should guarantee results, that the universe operates on some fundamental principle of fairness, where effort input equals success output. We see this contradiction everywhere, and yet we rarely acknowledge it directly because to do so would require us to abandon one of the most comforting myths we tell ourselves, the story that we are fundamentally in control of our outcomes, that if we simply work hard enough, we can transcend circumstances and achieve our dreams. The persistence of this belief, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, represents one of the most elegant forms of psychological denial, where we reinterpret failure not as evidence that hard work is insufficient, but as evidence that someone did not work hard enough, or did not work in the correct way, or lacked some intangible quality like grit or resilience, thus preserving the fundamental narrative while blaming the individual for its failure to manifest in their lives. We have normalized this impossible standard to such a degree that we rarely pause to consider how fundamentally dishonest it is, how it serves to keep people striving endlessly toward outcomes that remain statistically impossible for the vast majority regardless of their effort, and how this invisible contract between hard work and success has become the primary tool through which we maintain the illusion of meritocracy in a world structured by forces far larger and more indifferent than any individual's work ethic. The cruelest aspect of this arrangement is that those who benefit most from structural advantages are often the ones who most loudly proclaim the sufficiency of hard work, having never needed to discover its limits, while those who have worked themselves to exhaustion only to remain trapped in their circumstances are left to internalize the message that their failure is somehow personal. A deficiency of character rather than a consequence of operating within a system deliberately constructed to concentrate success among the already advantaged. This mechanism of self-blame becomes so internalized that people often spend their remaining energy not questioning the system, but attempting to work even harder, chasing an ever-receding horizon of effort that promises. Consider the person who has devoted their entire existence to acts of genuine kindness, to helping others without expectation of reward, to living with integrity and compassion even when no one is watching. And yet this same person experiences profound hardship, illness, loss, and pain that seems entirely disproportionate to the moral character they have cultivated over decades. We observe this pattern repeatedly throughout human experience, and yet it remains deeply unsettling each time we encounter it, because it violates something fundamental in our intuitive sense of how the world should operate. The cancer diagnosis does not discriminate between the volunteer and the indifferent bystander. The financial ruin does not spare the honest person while punishing only the corrupt. The tragic accident does not select its victims based on their virtue or their contributions to society. A parent who has spent their life caring for others loses their child to disease. A teacher who has inspired generations finds themselves isolated and forgotten in old age. A caregiver who has sacrificed their own well-being for family members experiences loneliness and abandonment. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is actually quite simple when examined logically, though we resist acknowledging it because of what it implies about existence itself. The universe operates according to physical laws that are entirely indifferent to human morality, to our choices about how to treat one another, to our efforts to be good people. Suffering is distributed through the mechanisms of biology, probability, chemistry, and physics, not through some cosmic justice system that tallies our good deeds and protects us proportionally. A virus does not recognize moral character. Gravity does not negotiate with the virtuous. A random mutation does not check someone's ethical record before deciding whether to cause disease. This fundamental truth persists despite making us profoundly uncomfortable, despite our deep cultural investment in narratives suggesting that goodness is rewarded and that morality matters in concrete protective ways. We have created entire religious and philosophical systems specifically designed to reconcile this contradiction, developing theories about divine plans, karmic cycles, soul growth through suffering, and eternal rewards that balance earthly injustice. Yet none of these frameworks change the observable reality that suffering remains randomly distributed regardless of moral character, and that good people continue to hurt just as much as anyone else, perhaps sometimes more so because they carry additional weight of confusion and betrayal when pain arrives in their lives. The parent who devoted their life to teaching their children kindness finds themselves questioning whether any of it mattered when tragedy strikes without warning. Perhaps the deepest suffering for good people arrives not merely from the pain itself, but from the shattering realization that their goodness was never a shield, that virtue and suffering operate in entirely separate domains, answering to no common logic or fair exchange. And yet, paradoxically, this very vulnerability and exposure to meaningless suffering often becomes the source of their deepest compassion, not because suffering is redemptive or purposeful, but because they have learned through direct experience that pain asks nothing of its victims and offers no explanations, a knowledge that transforms how they hold space for the suffering of others. This paradox that goodness creates neither protection nor explanation, yet paradoxically deepens one's capacity to witness suffering in others, may be the only meaningful response available to us, not to prevent the random distribution of pain, but to meet it with eyes wide open, unblinded by the false comfort of believing that virtue earns immunity. In this way, the good person's suffering becomes not a punishment for their virtue, but an invitation to a more honest form of love, one that does not expect the universe to reward their kindness, yet chooses kindness anyway, in full awareness of its futility and its absolute necessity. Consider the observable reality that surrounds us in every era and every society. The individuals who cheat, lie, manipulate, and prioritize their own advancement above all ethical considerations frequently end up with more money, more power, more influence, and more comfort than those who play by the rules and maintain their integrity throughout their lives. The person who cuts corners in business, who steals credit for others' work, who destroys competitors through dishonest means, who manipulates their way into positions of authority, often accumulates wealth and status that the honest person working diligently in the same field will never approach. This is not a rare aberration or an occasional misfortune. This is a systematic pattern that repeats so consistently across history and across cultures that we must confront the possibility that the game itself is rigged in favor of those willing to abandon their principles. The ruthless executive who fires loyal employees to boost quarterly earnings gets the promotion and the bonus, while the compassionate manager who fights to protect their team's interests gets passed over. The politician who makes promises they never intended to keep gets elected, while the candidate with sincere intentions but less charisma loses. The entrepreneur who cuts ethical corners reaches the billionaire class, while the one who insists on fair labor practices and sustainable practices remains comparatively modest. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is elegant in its simplicity. Morality is a constraint that the unscrupulous refuse to accept, and constraints always slow you down. When you decide that lying is acceptable, you gain options that the truthful person has eliminated from their decision tree. When you decide that other people's suffering is irrelevant if it benefits you, you free yourself from the paralysis that empathy creates. When you accept that the rules are merely suggestions designed to keep the powerless obedient while the powerful ignore them anyway, you suddenly have access to strategies and shortcuts that those bound by principle cannot employ. The honest person hesitates, the dishonest person acts. The ethical person considers consequences beyond themselves, the immoral person considers only their own benefit. Over time, in a competitive landscape where resources are finite and advantage is relative, those willing to pay no moral cost accumulate more than those who constantly weigh their actions against an internal ethical code. What makes this phenomenon particularly disturbing is that it persists not because the world is especially dark or uniquely corrupted, but because we have built systems that reward it and normalize the idea that this is simply how things work. We teach children that honesty and hard work will lead to success, yet the evidence they accumulate throughout their lives contradicts this repeatedly, and rather than acknowledge this contradiction, we blame the individual who fails rather than the system that betrays the promise. We create laws and regulations that are meant to prevent the worst abuses, yet we simultaneously create legal departments and accounting strategies specifically designed to circumvent these protections while remaining technically within the law. We celebrate the successful entrepreneur without investigating too deeply into their methods, and we accept their wealth as proof of their merit rather than as potential evidence of their ruthlessness. This normalization allows the pattern to continue uninterrupted, because to acknowledge it fully would require us to admit that the fundamental fairness we were promised as children does not exist, and most people find that admission too destabilizing to contemplate for long. So we construct elaborate justifications. We tell ourselves that the ruthless person is simply more driven, that the cheater is smarter, that the manipulator is a natural leader, when what we're really doing is rebranding immorality as superiority, converting our discomfort with an unjust reality into admiration for those who exploit it most effectively. Consider the experience of waking up one morning to discover that someone you believed would remain in your life indefinitely has decided to leave, often with little warning and sometimes with minimal explanation. And this phenomenon occurs with such regularity across human experience that we have developed entire industries and cultural narratives around processing this particular form of loss. Two people can spend years building a life together, making plans that extend into decades, speaking about futures in the language of permanence and certainty, and yet one day one of them simply decides that this arrangement no longer serves them, and by evening the entire architecture of shared existence has collapsed into ruins. What makes this especially disorienting is that relationships rarely end because of a single catastrophic event that both parties saw coming. Instead, they often end because one person gradually stopped feeling what they once felt, or because they realized they wanted something different, or because they met someone else, or simply because the slow erosion of daily life wore away at their commitment until one morning they woke up and recognized they had already left emotionally weeks or months ago. The psychological mechanism underlying this phenomenon operates through what we might call the discontinuity of human emotion and desire, where feelings that seemed permanent prove to be temporary, where commitment that felt unshakable reveals itself to be conditional, and where the person you thought you knew intimately turns out to have inner dimensions and evolving priorities that were always their own and never truly yours to control or predict. We spend our entire lives being taught that love is the exception to entropy, that human connection defies the universal tendency toward disorder and dissolution. Yet the statistical reality shows us that most intimate partnerships will end through either breakup or death, and most will end in ways that at least one party did not anticipate or want. What persists despite this knowledge is our continued willingness to believe that our specific relationship will be different, that our love is somehow more durable than the love that failed in the relationships we witness ending around us constantly. And we maintain this belief even though we possess no actual evidence that our situation diverges from the pattern, suggesting that we have a profound psychological need to maintain hope about permanence even when all available data suggests we should expect impermanence as the baseline condition of human bonding. Perhaps this paradox, maintaining hope against evidence, is not a failure of logic but rather a necessary precondition for intimacy itself. We cannot truly open ourselves to another person while simultaneously accepting as probable their eventual departure, and so we choose the comforting illusion of permanence as the price of being able to love at all. And so when the ending comes, sudden or gradual, mutual or one-sided, we find ourselves not only grieving the loss of the person, but also mourning the collapse of the necessary fiction that sustained our ability to love them in the first place, which may explain why breakups feel like a double betrayal. We have lost both the relationship and our right to have believed in it as we did. The person who leaves often cannot articulate why with precision, and the person who is left often cannot stop asking, creating a final asymmetry where one party has already begun the work of moving forward, while the other remains trapped in the interrogation of what went wrong. Searching for the moment of rupture they somehow missed despite living through every day of the relationship's slow unraveling. And so they replay conversations searching for warning signs that were never clearly marked as such. They construct alternative narratives where they had paid closer attention or been more attentive. They imagine versions of themselves who might have prevented this outcome, all the while the other person has already accepted the ending and moved into a different emotional territory entirely, which Kriya. Consider the moment when someone looks you directly in the eye and tells you they will be there for you, that they will call you next week, that they will remember your birthday, that they will change, that they will be different this time, that they will never leave you. And you believe them because the conviction in their voice seems genuine and the intention behind their words feels real and solid in that precise moment of utterance. You feel the weight of their commitment settling into your chest like something tangible and permanent, and you allow yourself to relax into the comfort of knowing that this promise is a binding contract between two people who care about each other. But then days pass and the promise begins to fade not from your memory, but from theirs, as if it was written in sand, and the tide of their ordinary life has simply washed it away without ceremony or explanation. The phone call never comes. The birthday passes without acknowledgement. The change never materializes. The person does leave, just as they promised they would not, and when you remind them of what they said, you see a flicker of genuine confusion in their eyes, as though they are searching through their mind for something that was never properly stored in the first place. This happens not because people are inherently malicious or because they deliberately set out to deceive, but because promises exist in a strange liminal space between intention and reality, between the emotional resonance of a moment and the structural demands of sustained behavior. The human brain is remarkably skilled at forgetting commitments the moment they become inconvenient, the moment they require sacrifice, the moment other impulses or desires take precedence. We make promises in moments of peak emotional clarity, when our best selves are temporarily in control, when we are flooded with oxytocin and goodwill and the genuine belief that we will be different, that we will remember, that we will follow through. But the human mind is designed for the present moment, for immediate survival, for tending to what is in front of us right now rather than honoring abstract future obligations we made to our past selves. And so promises fade like dreams upon waking, becoming increasingly unreal with each passing day, until the person who made them can almost convince themselves that they never said it at all, or that what they said was understood differently, or that circumstances changed in ways that made it impossible. We have built an entire civilization on top of promises, on contracts and vows and commitments and agreements, yet we remain fundamentally creatures who forget, who prioritize, who let go of what seemed essential just weeks before. The disturbing truth is that we have normalized this forgetting so completely that we rarely hold each other accountable for broken promises unless they involve legal documents or financial transactions. We expect people to forget our promises while simultaneously making new promises to others, caught in an endless cycle of good intentions followed by convenient amnesia, all while telling ourselves and each other that we mean what we say in the moment we say it, which is perhaps the truest thing about us and also the most tragic. And so we move through our relationships like people walking through a house of mirrors, each reflection showing us a version of ourselves we genuinely believed in at the time, while the original promise recedes into a corridor we can no longer quite locate, leaving only the person who was promised to, standing alone, trying to remember if they imagined the whole thing. And perhaps that is the cruelest part, not that we forget promises, but that we forget the person who believed in us enough to take them at their word, transforming them from someone worthy of our commitment into someone whose disappointment becomes an inconvenience we would prefer not to acknowledge. So we learn to make smaller promises, to ask for less, to protect ourselves by expecting nothing, until the act of believing someone becomes not a sign of hope, but a measure of our own desperation. Consider the modern landscape of human discourse, where billions of people spend countless hours each day constructing, refining, defending, and broadcasting their opinions about everything from politics and morality to entertainment and personal relationships. Yet the fundamental reality remains that in the vast majority of circumstances, these opinions produce no measurable impact on the world whatsoever. A person might spend an entire evening formulating a detailed critique of a film, carefully articulating why they believe the cinematography was inadequate or the plot fundamentally flawed, and when they present this opinion to others, nothing changes. The film remains exactly as it was. The director does not alter their artistic vision based on one person's assessment, and the universe continues its expansion entirely indifferent to their judgment. This phenomenon extends across every domain of human experience, where we have created elaborate systems and hierarchies specifically designed to make people believe their perspectives matter, when in fact the overwhelming majority of opinions are noise, vibrations in the air that dissipate moments after they are spoken or written. The psychological mechanism that sustains this illusion operates through a deeply ingrained need for significance and agency, a human requirement to believe that our thoughts, our evaluations, our inner worlds possess some kind of externalized consequence or relevance beyond the mere fact of their existence within our own consciousness. We are creatures who desperately need to matter, And so we have constructed entire economies and social structures around the collection and valorization of opinions, creating platforms where opinions can be aggregated, ranked, counted, and made visible to others, which gives them the appearance of importance even though they remain fundamentally impotent. The persistence of this illusion is particularly striking because it requires no active conspiracy or external force to maintain itself. It sustains through the simple fact that humans find it psychologically unbearable to fully accept the insignificance of their internal mental lives, the reality that thinking something does not make it true or important or consequential in any meaningful way. We watch people argue with strangers on the internet about topics that will never affect either party's life in any detectable way, spending emotional energy and mental resources as though the outcome of the disagreement somehow carries weight, when the truth is that both people will forget the exchange within days and nothing will have changed in the material world because of their debate. This normalization occurs so completely that we barely notice it anymore, that we participate in opinion sharing and opinion formation as though it were a fundamental aspect of human existence, rather than a relatively recent social construct that serves primarily to distract us from the reality that most of our thoughts and evaluations are simply the firing of neurons in response to stimuli. Interesting perhaps from a neuroscientific perspective, but utterly incapable of altering external reality through the mere fact of their presence in someone's mind. Yet perhaps the cruelest aspect of this delusion is that it makes us genuinely suffer. We experience real anguish over opinions that don't matter, real anxiety about whether our views will be accepted or validated, real anger when others disagree with assessments that have no consequence whatsoever, transforming the inherent meaninglessness of our thoughts into genuine emotional pain through the sheer force of our collective insistence that they should mean something. And so we find ourselves trapped in a recursive loop where the pain of insignificance drives us to seek validation through opinions, which produces more pain when that validation fails to materialize, a cycle that could only be interrupted by the acceptance that our inner evaluations need no external confirmation to justify their existence within our own minds. Yet this acceptance remains perhaps the most difficult truth for any human consciousness to. Consider the monuments built by ancient civilizations, the vast stone structures raised at tremendous cost and effort, intended to last forever and carry the names and deeds of their builders into eternity. Yet today we struggle to even remember who commissioned them or what they truly meant to the people who created them. Think about the most famous figures in history, the emperors and generals and artists whose names seemed burned into the collective memory, and how within just 2 or 3 generations after their death, the details of their lives begin to blur and distort, their accomplishments reinterpreted through the lens of new eras that have little connection to their original context. The mechanism behind this fading is deceptively simple. Each generation has its own immediate concerns, its own struggles and triumphs, its own people to remember and celebrate, and the figures from the past gradually become less relevant to the lived experience of those who come after. A great warrior's battlefield victories lose their significance when that battlefield's location has been paved over by a shopping center, when the nations he fought against have disappeared from the map entirely, when the reasons for his wars have become so historically distant that they require textbooks to even begin to understand. The accomplishments of your grandparents or great-grandparents, which felt monumental during their lifetime, often become little more than a few sentences in a family story that grandchildren half listen to, and by the time those children have children of their own, the details have been forgotten entirely, condensed into vague notions that their ancestor was important somehow, but nobody quite remembers why. We spend our lives accumulating achievements and building things and leaving our mark, operating under the assumption that our work will endure, that our names will mean something to future generations. Yet the historical record shows us that this is almost never the case, that obscurity is the default state for human endeavor, that even many who believed themselves to be immortal in their fame have been reduced to footnotes in academic papers. What persists despite this clear evidence is the illusion that our particular legacy will be different, that somehow our work or our name or our family will escape this universal law of fading, that we possess something special that will ensure remembrance, an assumption so deeply embedded in human psychology that even those who intellectually understand the impermanence of legacy cannot quite shake the feeling that theirs might endure. And this contradiction between knowing that all legacies fade and believing that ours somehow won't remains one of the most persistent and unchallenged self-deceptions in human life. Perhaps this is not entirely a flaw in human thinking, but rather a necessary illusion. Without the belief that our efforts might endure, that our name might mean something to someone years from now, we would struggle to find motivation for anything beyond immediate survival. And so we persist in this beautiful delusion, building our monuments and raising our children and creating our art, knowing and not knowing that we are writing in sand. Yet perhaps there is a quiet dignity in this, that we build and create and strive not because we believe our names will echo through centuries, but because the act of building itself, the effort itself, the brief moment in which we matter to someone is enough, and the sand we write in shifts and erases not because our efforts were meaningless, but because meaning itself is always temporary, always local, always dependent on someone being there in that moment to witness it. And so the monuments crumble not because they were built poorly, but because the world that gave them meaning has moved on, and we are left with only the structure itself, stripped of context, a beautiful ruin that tells us almost nothing about the hands that built it or the hearts that once believed in its permanence. When someone tells you something you did not want to hear, something that contradicts your self-image or your understanding of the world, there is a distinct and measurable pain that follows, a sensation so real that it registers in your brain similarly to physical injury. And this phenomenon persists across every culture, every era, and every psychological profile because truth has a particular quality that fiction and comforting lies do not possess. The pain emerges not from the words themselves, but from the collision between what you believe to be true and what you are now forced to accept as reality. A collision that demands immediate psychological reorganization, a tearing down of existing mental structures, and the exhausting work of rebuilding them with new information as the foundation. Consider the person who discovers that a trusted partner has been unfaithful, or the professional who learns they are not as skilled as they imagined, or the individual who realizes their parent is fundamentally flawed and fallible rather than heroic and infallible. And in each case, the pain is not proportional to the severity of the truth, but rather to the distance between the comfortable lie and the stark reality, because the farther apart these two things exist, the greater the psychological work required to close that gap. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is rooted in cognitive dissonance, that deeply uncomfortable mental state that occurs when your beliefs and your new information cannot coexist, and your mind will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid this discomfort, will rationalize and deny and bargain with itself, and only when it finally surrenders and accepts the truth does the actual pain begin, because acceptance means changing who you thought you were. What makes this phenomenon so persistent and so universal is that we continually find ourselves seeking comfort over accuracy, preferring the gentle architecture of useful illusions to the cold architecture of reality. And yet we are also creatures who eventually must encounter truth, must face it, must absorb it. And this guarantee of future pain does not deter us from constructing new illusions as soon as the old ones shatter. Suggesting that perhaps the human mind is fundamentally designed to seek the comfort of story over the accuracy of fact. Yet we also possess an inexplicable drive to know, to understand, to see reality as it actually is rather than as we wish it to be. And this internal conflict between these two opposing drives ensures that truth will always hurt, and hurt most profoundly, because it requires us to simultaneously grieve what we believed and accept what is actually true. The price of this knowledge is that we become unable to return to innocence, unable to unknow what we have learned, and this permanence of truth, this inability to reverse our understanding once it has shifted, may be the deepest hurt of all, because it means we must live forward with altered vision, carrying both the weight of reality and the ghost of the comforting story we can never fully believe again. Yet perhaps this is where the deepest wisdom emerges, in recognizing that the capacity to bear truth, to feel its pain and integrate it anyway, is not a weakness but the very foundation of genuine growth, and that those who can endure this particular hurt are the ones who eventually transcend the need for comforting illusions altogether. This is why the wisest among us do not shy away from truth, but rather develop a kind of courage that allows them to seek it out deliberately, to ask the hard questions and listen to the difficult answers, understanding that each truth absorbed, however painful, is a small death of the false self and a birth of something more authentic, more resilient, and ultimately more capable of navigating the actual world rather than the imagined one. And so we return again and again to this choice, to remain comfortable in our delusions or to accept the sting of reality, knowing that each time we choose truth, we strengthen our capacity to bear the next truth, until eventually the hurt transforms into something else entirely, not Consider the life you are living right now, the routines you have established, the beliefs you hold dear, the relationships that structure your days, and the identity you have constructed with such care and deliberation over many years. Now consider that none of these things will remain as they are, that transformation is not something you will choose at a time of your own convenience, but rather something that will be imposed upon you by the relentless forward motion of time itself and the circumstances that arise unbidden in your path. You may spend decades building a career that becomes obsolete, investing your emotional energy into relationships that end through death or departure, maintaining a body that inevitably decays regardless of your efforts, or cultivating beliefs that are shattered by experience. The disturbing truth is that change does not wait for your readiness or your permission. It arrives like weather, like aging, like the shifting of continents beneath the surface of the earth. You believe you are in control of your own transformation, that you make conscious decisions about who you become and how you evolve, but this belief obscures a deeper reality. Most significant change in human life is reactive rather than proactive. You do not choose to grieve until someone dies. You do not choose to become anxious until a threat presents itself. You do not choose to abandon your worldview until reality contradicts it so forcefully that you can no longer maintain the fiction. The psychological mechanism at work here is a form of denial wrapped in the language of agency. You tell yourself stories about change as something you direct and control, stories about personal growth and transformation that you orchestrate through self-improvement and intention. These stories are comforting because they suggest that you are the author of your own narrative, that you possess the ability to shape your destiny. Yet beneath this narrative lies the uncomfortable truth that you are fundamentally responsive to forces far larger than yourself. External circumstances force you to adapt or perish. Economic systems force you to retrain or become irrelevant. Relationships force you to compromise or dissolve. Your body forces you to acknowledge limitation and mortality. Society forces you to abandon behaviors and beliefs that were once acceptable. You have normalized this forced change by rebranding it as personal growth and self-discovery, by pretending that your adaptations were choices rather than necessities, by celebrating the resilience required to survive transformations you never wanted and never anticipated. This allows you to maintain the illusion of control while you are actually being shaped by forces beyond your influence, remaining complicit in your own transformation while telling yourself the story of your agency. The tragedy is not that change is forced upon you, but that you will spend your life believing you chose it, constructing elaborate narratives of intentionality around transformations that circumstance dictated. And in doing so, you will never fully grieve what was taken from you or acknowledge the extent to which you have been remade by forces indifferent to your preferences. By the time you recognize how thoroughly you have been transformed, the person you were before exists only in memory, increasingly unreliable and edited, making it impossible to know whether you have evolved or simply been eroded into someone new. And perhaps this is the cruelest aspect of forced change, that you will never know with certainty whether the person you have become is who you were meant to be or simply who circumstance has made you, leaving you forever unable to distinguish between destiny and erosion, between growth and loss. This ambiguity becomes your permanent condition. You will live as though you are choosing, even as you are being chosen for, and the gap between these two truths will remain the defining mystery of your existence, one you will likely never fully resolve. There exists a fundamental paradox in the human condition that we rarely acknowledge with full honesty, which is that the very circumstances we spend our entire lives pursuing, the comfort and security we believe will finally make us happy and fulfilled, are actually the architects of our gradual decline and deterioration. When a person finds themselves in a state of genuine comfort, when their basic needs are met, when their environment is predictable and safe, when they no longer face meaningful resistance or challenge in their daily existence, something begins to happen at the deepest levels of their physiology and psychology that resembles a kind of slow erosion of their capabilities, their resilience, and their fundamental strength. The muscles of the body atrophy without use and without stress, but more profoundly, the muscles of the mind and spirit undergo a similar process of weakening when they are never demanded to stretch beyond their current capacity or to confront genuine adversity. Consider the athlete who trains relentlessly in harsh conditions, who pushes their body to the edge of its limits repeatedly, and observe how their capabilities expand and strengthen in direct proportion to the difficulty they willingly endure, while simultaneously observe the person who has secured complete comfort and safety and notice how their physical vitality begins to decline, how their mental acuity seems to dull, how their sense of purpose seems to evaporate into meaninglessness. This occurs because the human organism, the human consciousness itself, evolved not for comfort but for survival, for challenge, for the constant negotiation with difficulty and pain and uncertainty. Our ancestors did not become strong by resting in comfortable environments. They became strong through exposure to cold, through hunger, through the constant threat of predation and disease and social conflict. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is that comfort eliminates the stimulus for growth, and without growth, without the constant demand for adaptation and improvement, the human system simply begins to decline by default. The brain requires challenge to maintain its neural pathways and to generate new connections. The body requires stress to maintain its muscular and skeletal integrity. The spirit requires meaning and purpose and struggle to feel alive and engaged with existence. Yet despite understanding this principle with perfect clarity, despite the fact that anyone who examines history can see this truth written across the entire record of human achievement, we have constructed modern civilization around the principle of maximizing comfort and minimizing challenge and resistance at every possible opportunity. We medicate our pain instead of learning from it. We remove obstacles from our paths instead of developing the strength to overcome them. We seek ease instead of embracing the difficulty that would make us capable and resilient. The tragedy is that we have normalized this weakness. We have made it respectable and admirable. We have created entire systems and institutions designed to insulate us from discomfort, while never questioning whether this insulation is actually serving us or slowly suffocating us beneath the weight of our own ease. The individual who has never known hunger cannot appreciate sustenance. The mind that has never struggled cannot recognize its own potential. And the soul that has never confronted genuine suffering becomes incapable of experiencing authentic joy or meaning, for these experiences exist only in relation to their opposites, and comfort without the memory of hardship is merely a slow fade into irrelevance and spiritual death. The paradox resolves only when we understand that true strength is not something we achieve and then possess permanently, but rather something we must continually earn through deliberate discomfort, through the choice to seek resistance even when we have the luxury of avoiding it, through the willingness to remain unsettled in a world designed to settle us into complacency. There exists a peculiar condition that affects countless individuals throughout their lives, a recognition that arrives with varying degrees of awareness and acceptance, and it centers on the notion that the best moments, the highest points of achievement and vitality, have already occurred and will never be matched again. For many people, this peak comes early in adulthood when the body operates at maximum efficiency, when career prospects seemed unlimited and full of possibility, when romantic potential felt infinite, and when the future stretched endlessly before them like an unmapped territory waiting to be explored. The peak might have been a specific year in high school when social status was highest, or a period in college when friendships felt most genuine and unburdened by adult responsibilities, or perhaps that first job when everything seemed new and the trajectory upward appeared inevitable and assured. What makes this recognition so profoundly disorienting is that once you begin to sense it, once you start to understand that the best version of your life has already passed, you cannot stop seeing evidence of it everywhere. Your metabolism slows, your recovery from exertion takes longer, your memory becomes less sharp, and the things that once excited you begin to feel repetitive rather than novel. The mechanism behind this is partially biological, as the human body genuinely does decline in certain measurable ways after young adulthood, but it is also deeply psychological because we attach meaning and value to novelty and progress, and once novelty becomes scarcer, the emotional texture of experience fundamentally changes. Each new year begins to feel more like the last one, each accomplishment more hollow than the previous, and each relationship somehow less transformative than the ones you remember from your past. What persists despite this being an entirely natural aspect of aging is the unspoken grief of it all, the way we continue to live as though the peak might still arrive, as though tomorrow might bring that transcendent experience that will finally match what we felt before, all while the evidence accumulates that we are statistically living in decline from a point that has already passed behind us. And yet we organize our lives around the stubborn belief that redemption is still possible. We join gyms, start new projects, enter new relationships, not necessarily from hope, but from the inability to fully accept that the arithmetic of a life might already be settled, that we might be spending our remaining years in a kind of extended denouement, performing for an audience that has already begun to leave. We tell ourselves that this is maturity, that we are becoming wise to the impermanence of things, but wisdom feels suspiciously like consolation, a narrative we construct to make bearable the simple fact that we will never again feel as alive as we did when we believed the best was still ahead of us. Perhaps the cruelest irony is that the wisdom we gain, the perspective that comes from having lived through enough to understand what truly matters, arrives precisely when our capacity to act on it begins to diminish, when we finally know what we should have valued all along but lack the vitality to fully inhabit that knowledge, leaving us to watch our younger selves make the same mistakes we did, unable to warn them that they are squandering the very peak they cannot yet recognize they are living through. And so we exist in this strange temporal limbo, simultaneously living in the present while mourning a past we only fully appreciated in retrospect, watching our children approach their own peaks with the helpless knowledge that they too will one day stand where we stand now, looking backward at a version of themselves they took for granted, wondering when exactly the descent began. The cruelest part is that recognition itself changes nothing. You cannot retroactively enjoy the peak by finally understanding it was a peak, and you cannot accelerate towards some new summit because the topography of a life, once mapped, reveals that all the highest ground lies behind you. Throughout human history, we observe a consistent pattern where individuals and entire civilizations reach their zenith of power and influence, only to collapse under the weight of their own certainty, and this phenomenon extends far beyond simple arrogance, manifesting instead as a fundamental distortion of perception that prevents those at the top from seeing reality as it truly exists. When a person or organization achieves success, they accumulate evidence that their methods work, their judgments are sound, and their understanding of the world is correct. And this accumulation of positive outcomes begins to cement a particular version of the self that feels invulnerable and beyond reproach, creating what psychologists call a resilience bias where past victories are interpreted as proof of inherent superiority rather than as the result of circumstance, timing, preparation, or simple luck. The mechanism operates subtly and insidiously because pride does not announce itself as pride. Instead, it disguises itself as confidence, as earned certainty, as the natural result of competence, and this disguise is so effective that the prideful person cannot distinguish between accurate self-assessment and dangerous overestimation, much like someone whose eyes have adjusted to a dim room cannot perceive the true brightness when they step outside. What makes pride particularly destructive is that it simultaneously closes the mind while opening the mouth, causing successful people to speak with greater authority while listening with less curiosity. And this creates an environment where no one around them dares to offer honest feedback because the person's identity has become so entangled with their achievements that criticism feels like a personal attack. We watch CEOs run companies into bankruptcy because they cannot accept that markets change and their original insight no longer applies. We see talented artists produce progressively worse work because they have stopped listening to the actual responses of their audience and begun instead to serve their own image of themselves as a visionary. We observe politicians cling to failed policies because admitting error would contradict the narrative of infallibility they have constructed. The truly disturbing aspect is that pride becomes most dangerous precisely when it is most justified, because the person who has genuinely earned their success through years of hard work and genuine talent becomes the most vulnerable to believing that their judgment is always reliable. And this creates a cruel paradox where excellence becomes the breeding ground for the blindness that destroys it. Pride persists despite having no logical foundation for its persistence because it operates beneath the level of conscious thought. It feels like home to the ego, and it provides protection against the existential anxiety that comes from acknowledging that we are not in control and that our understanding of reality is fundamentally limited and subject to revision. The antidote, then, is not the destruction of confidence or the abandonment of self-belief, but rather the cultivation of what might be called confident humility, the ability to act decisively while remaining genuinely open to the possibility that one's understanding is incomplete, and this requires the daily practice of seeking out contradiction, actively inviting criticism from those we trust, and maintaining a realistic assessment of how much of our success depends on factors entirely beyond our control. The leaders and creators who understand this paradox, who maintain their edge while staying genuinely curious about their blind spots, are the rare ones who sustain their excellence across decades rather than flaming out in a single generation, and their example suggests that our greatest achievements are not threatened by doubt, but rather preserved by it. The paradox deepens when we realize that the very humility required to sustain excellence is itself threatened by pride. For the moment we become proud of our humility, we have lost it entirely, and the spiral begins anew. Consider the perfectly ordinary moment when you scroll through the life of someone you know, seeing their vacation photos, their new house, their promotion announcement, their relationship milestone, and feel something shift inside you, something that wasn't there before you saw those images. You had been content moments earlier, satisfied with your own circumstances, but now you find yourself mentally cataloging what you lack, measuring the distance between where you are and where they are, as though life were a race with a single finish line, and you had somehow fallen behind without realizing it. This is the mechanism of comparison, and it operates with such subtle precision that we rarely notice it working until the damage is already done, until contentment has transformed into a gnawing sense of inadequacy that follows you through your day like a shadow you cannot escape. The human mind, it seems, was never designed to evaluate its own condition in isolation. Instead, we are compelled by something ancient and deeply embedded within our consciousness to measure ourselves against others, to establish hierarchies and rankings, to determine where we stand in an imagined pecking order that exists primarily in our own thoughts. When you compare yourself to someone who has achieved more, earned more, accumulated more, or appears to be happier, your brain processes this information not as a neutral observation, but as evidence of your own failure, as proof that you are somehow lacking, that you have made wrong choices, that you are moving too slowly through a life that everyone else seems to be navigating with greater skill and confidence than you possess. What makes this particularly insidious is that comparison operates on a completely irrational foundation, because the person you are comparing yourself to is not actually living your life, is not facing your specific circumstances, your particular challenges, your unique constraints and opportunities, yet we treat their external results as though they were achieved under identical conditions to our own, as though success were purely a matter of will and effort rather than timing, luck, family circumstances, and countless other variables that remain largely invisible to us. We have created an entire digital infrastructure now that makes comparison not merely possible but essentially mandatory, scrolling endlessly through carefully curated highlight reels that present only the most flattering angles of other people's lives, while we simultaneously judge ourselves against these unrealistic standards while viewing our own lives in their complete, unfiltered, unglamorous reality. The cruel mathematics of this arrangement ensures that we will always find someone doing better, someone achieving more, someone appearing happier, because the human population is vast and the spectrum of human achievement is equally vast, which means that no matter where you stand, there will always be someone ahead of you in whatever dimension you choose to measure. And this mathematical certainty transforms comparison from an occasional thought into a guaranteed source of perpetual dissatisfaction. Yet we persist in this behavior despite understanding, at some level, that it makes no logical sense, that the achievement of another person does not diminish our own achievements, that someone else's success does not make our lives less valuable or less worth living, and that the qualities we envy in others may come bundled with struggles and costs and sacrifices that we would never want to bear ourselves. We have somehow normalized this self-torture, accepting it as simply the price of existence in the modern world, as though suffering from constant comparison were an inevitable feature of consciousness, rather than a choice we make every time we pick up our devices and subject ourselves to the carefully constructed illusion that everyone else is living a better version of life than we are, moving steadily forward while we remain stuck in place. Consider the person who arrives at work before everyone else and leaves after everyone else, who stays late into the evening refining their craft, who reads books on their field during weekends, who practices their skills during hours when others rest, and yet receives no acknowledgement, no praise, no recognition from those around them. Effort remains invisible because visibility in modern life is not determined by the hours spent or the dedication applied, but rather by the results that are immediately observable and the narrative that gets constructed around those results. When someone finally produces something extraordinary, the observer sees only the finished product, the moment of success, the apparent overnight breakthrough, and they credit talent or luck rather than the thousands of hours of unseen preparation that preceded it. The mechanisms behind this phenomenon run deep within human psychology and social structure. People have a cognitive limitation that prevents them from truly comprehending effort that exists outside their direct observation, and so the mind fills in the gaps with simpler explanations that require less mental effort to maintain. A person's worth becomes calculated not by their input but by their output, and the gap between effort and observable results creates a void where human appreciation should logically exist. We have built systems and societies that measure only endpoints, not the journeys taken to reach them, and we have normalized this to such a degree that people begin to believe their own effort should be invisible, should be expected, should require no external validation. The person who works the hardest often becomes invisible precisely because their work has become so integrated into the environment that it is taken for granted, absorbed into the baseline of what is expected rather than celebrated as exceptional. And despite knowing intellectually that all achievement requires effort, despite understanding logically that nothing worthwhile comes without dedication and time invested, we continue to structure our recognition systems to reward only the visible moments, only the achievements we can point to, leaving countless hours of invisible labor unacknowledged and unappreciated, fading into the background of someone's life as if those hours never truly mattered at all. Yet perhaps the cruelest aspect is that the person who works in silence often internalizes this invisibility, beginning to question whether their effort was ever real at all, whether the countless hours spent in solitude and discipline were worthwhile if no one witnessed them, if no one can verify that they occurred. In this way, unnoticed effort doesn't just fade from the world's memory, it erodes the worker's own sense of having mattered. And so the quiet worker becomes trapped in a paradox. They need external validation to confirm their internal worth, yet the very nature of their dedication, the humble, uncelebrated kind, makes such validation unlikely to arrive, leaving them to sustain themselves on faith alone that their sacrifice has meaning beyond what the world chooses to see. Perhaps this is why so many people eventually stop trying, not because they lack capability, but because the invisible effort becomes indistinguishable from invisibility itself. And at some point, the human spirit grows weary of pouring energy into a void that offers no echo back, no mirror to reflect that the work was ever real. So they choose visibility instead. They learn to perform their effort rather than practice it in silence, to narrate their work as they do it, to ensure that every sacrifice is witnessed and documented, trading the quiet integrity of unseen dedication for the hollow reassurance of being seen, only to discover that performing effort is exhausting in an entirely different way, and that the effort spent on visibility is effort no longer available for the work itself. And in this exhausting cycle, the original paradox remains unresolved. True mastery still requires the very invisibility that breaks the spirit, yet visibility itself becomes the enemy of excellence. There exists a particular cruelty in the human experience that operates so quietly and systematically that we rarely acknowledge it as the tragedy it truly is. And that cruelty is the inevitable forgetting of sacrifices made by those around us and even by ourselves. Consider the parent who works multiple jobs for decades, sacrificing sleep and health and time with their children, only to find that years later, their children remember not the exhaustion or the struggle or the nights their parent came home with aching joints and worry etched into their face, but rather remember a missed baseball game or a birthday party attended late or a Christmas morning when presents seemed fewer than at their friends' houses. Consider the friend who listens to another friend's problems for years, who drops their own plans repeatedly to offer comfort and counsel, who becomes so familiar with another person's pain that it becomes interwoven with their own sense of purpose, only to discover one day that this friend has drifted away, found new people, new confidants, and the sacrifice of emotional labor goes unremembered and unacknowledged as though it never occurred at all. The mechanism behind this forgetting is not malice, but rather the nature of human perception itself, for we are creatures who exist in the present moment, and the sacrifices of others tend to become the baseline of our experience rather than remaining as discrete acts of generosity worthy of remembrance. When someone consistently shows up for you, when they continuously put your needs before their own, this eventually becomes normalized, integrated into the landscape of your life as simply the way things are, and the active choice to sacrifice becomes invisible beneath the weight of habit and expectation. This normalization is compounded by the psychological tendency to focus on what we lack rather than what we have been given, meaning that a child raised by a sacrificing parent tends to remember absence more vividly than presence, tends to dwell on unmet desires rather than the met ones that required another person's suffering to accomplish. Furthermore, our brains are not equipped to maintain gratitude as a constant state. We are beings who adapt to our circumstances and take for granted the conditions we have grown accustomed to. And this adaptation serves us well in many contexts, but becomes devastating when applied to human relationships where sacrifice has been made. The person making the sacrifice often expects nothing in return, yet there remains some small, unspoken hope that their efforts will be remembered, that their choice to put another before themselves will be acknowledged, will matter, will leave some mark on the world and on the people they have done it for. And when that memory fades or never solidifies into conscious recognition, there is a particular flavor of grief that accompanies the realization. We have not only normalized this cycle, but have built our entire social and familial structures around the assumption that some people will make sacrifices and others will accept them without sustained gratitude. And we have created narratives that celebrate sacrifice in the abstract while simultaneously ensuring that sacrifices are forgotten in the specific, allowing us to maintain a convenient moral balance where we honor the concept of selflessness even as we systematically overlook and take for granted the selfless acts of those closest to us. And perhaps most painfully, when we finally do recognize a sacrifice, years later, after the person has stopped making it, after the relationship has changed or ended, the acknowledgement comes too late to matter, an apology offered to someone who has already learned to live without our gratitude, who has already absorbed the lesson that their efforts were ultimately invisible. And in this delayed recognition, we sometimes imagine that we are offering something meaningful, that we are finally seeing them, when in truth we are only documenting what has already been lost. The sacrifice itself remains forgotten, and we are merely mourning the forgetting. Consider the moment when someone speaks a harsh truth in anger, or delivers a cruel observation they've been harboring, or makes a joke at someone's expense that lands far heavier than intended, and then immediately realizes the damage they've caused. In that fraction of a second after the words leave their mouth, they might say they're sorry, they might try to soften what was said, they might offer explanations or context, but something fundamental has already shifted in the world. The words exist now in the space between two people, and no amount of apology or reframing can genuinely retrieve them from the mind of the person who heard them. This is one of the most peculiar and troubling asymmetries of human communication. We can delete emails, we can retract statements in writing, we can even spend years in therapy attempting to reprocess traumatic things we've heard, yet the original wound of the utterance itself remains, somehow intact and irreducible. The psychological mechanism at work here is rooted in how memory and emotion become intertwined during moments of surprise or pain. When someone hears something unexpected and hurtful, their brain doesn't simply record the information like a neutral recording device. Instead, the amygdala, the emotional processing center of the brain, floods the system with stress hormones at the exact moment the words are being perceived, which actually strengthens the encoding of that memory. The words become embedded not just as information but as experience, complete with the feeling of the moment they were delivered. This is why you can forget facts you studied for an exam, but you can remember with crystalline clarity something cruel someone said to you 15 years ago. The person who spoke the words imagines that an apology is a kind of verbal delete button, a way to undo the action through counteraction, but apologies operate in a different dimension entirely. An apology addresses responsibility and intention going forward, but it doesn't actually erase the neural pathways that were laid down when the harmful words were first processed. The disturbing part is how normalized this asymmetry has become in our understanding of language and communication. We teach children to say sorry, and we treat apology as though it is a genuine form of retrieval, as though saying you didn't mean something can somehow reach back in time and prevent the original utterance from having happened. Yet anyone who has been on either side of this dynamic knows this isn't quite true. There's a strange contradiction at the heart of how we've structured our moral understanding of speech. We hold people accountable for their words as though words are permanent and serious things. We write laws against slander and defamation that recognize the lasting damage words can cause, and yet we also maintain this fantasy that apology can truly undo them, that heartfelt regret can somehow unsay what has been said. Neither framework fully captures the reality. Words exist in a peculiar ontological space where they are simultaneously treated as both infinitely retrievable and completely irretrievable, and we've simply accepted this contradiction as the basic condition of being a speaking creature. Perhaps this is why the act of speaking itself carries such weight, why we pause before certain words, why we sometimes choose silence over honesty, why the most careful people among us seem to understand that language is less like a tool we can control and more like a force we release into the world, irreversibly altering it simply by giving it voice. And perhaps this is why the people we trust most are often those who have demonstrated through years of careful silence, through words deliberately not spoken, that they understand the weight of what they do choose to say. In this sense, restraint becomes its own form of eloquence, a tacit acknowledgement that some thresholds, once crossed in speech, genuinely cannot be recrossed. There exists a peculiar phenomenon in human consciousness where moments that have already ceased to exist continue to occupy space in our minds with the same intensity as though they were occurring in the present moment. And this haunting quality of memory reveals something fundamentally unsettling about the structure of time itself and our relationship to it. When you recall an embarrassing conversation from 10 years ago, or a moment where you failed someone you cared about, or a decision you made that altered the course of your life in ways you did not intend, the emotional weight of that memory can feel as acute and penetrating as if the event were happening right now. And this temporal distortion suggests that in some meaningful psychological sense, these moments have never actually left us at all. The brain does not experience time as a linear progression where the past is truly gone and relegated to some distant archive, but rather as an ongoing present tense where everything that has ever happened to us remains accessible and reactive, capable of producing the same neurochemical responses, the same emotional turbulence, the same sense of dread or shame or regret that the original event produced. We walk through our present lives carrying these ghosts with us, and they influence our decisions, our relationships, our sense of who we are, often without our conscious awareness or permission. The mechanism behind this haunting is rooted in the way memory encoding works, in how traumatic or emotionally significant moments create particularly strong neural pathways that remain perpetually primed for activation, making these memories more vivid and more readily accessible than mundane daily experiences that fade quickly into obscurity. Furthermore, we are creatures who derive narrative meaning from our past, and we constantly rewrite and reinterpret those narratives in light of new information and new perspectives, which means the past is not a fixed thing that we can move beyond, but rather an evolving story that we continue to engage with and reshape throughout our lives. What makes this particularly unsettling is that we have normalized this haunting quality as simply the human condition, treating it as an inevitable consequence of consciousness, rather than recognizing it as a form of psychological imprisonment from which we never truly escape. Because no matter how much time passes, no matter how much therapy or meditation or external success we accumulate, the past remains embedded in us, waiting in the shadows of our minds, ready to surface when we least expect it and remind us that we are not truly free agents moving forward into an open future, but rather beings perpetually tethered to everything we have ever done or failed to do, everything we have ever said or left unsaid, and the weight of this accumulated past never fully leaves us. It only teaches us the lesson that time itself is an illusion we invented to comfort ourselves. That separation from our past is merely a story we tell ourselves to avoid confronting the truth that we are always, in some profound and inescapable way, still there in those moments that supposedly happened long ago. And perhaps this is why we find ourselves unable to fully inhabit the present moment, always caught between the ghost of who we were and the anxiety of who we might become, trapped in a temporal paradox where the only moment that truly feels real is the one that has already passed, the one we cannot change, the one that continues to haunt us precisely because it is beyond our reach and yet somehow still within our grasp. This haunting persists even in our attempts to escape it. We change our names, move to new cities, reinvent ourselves entirely, yet the past follows like a shadow we cannot outrun, because the ghosts we carry are not external forces but integral parts of our psychology, woven into the very fabric of how we perceive ourselves and navigate the world, making any true escape impossible without a fundamental dissolution of identity itself. No matter how much planning you do, no matter how carefully you construct your life or how thoroughly you attempt to predict what comes next, the future remains fundamentally and irreducibly uncertain. And this uncertainty extends not just to the distant horizon of decades ahead, but to the immediate next moment, the next hour, the next decision that will reshape everything you thought you knew about where your life was heading. You wake up in the morning with expectations about how your day will unfold. You have written schedules and mental frameworks about what should happen and when it should happen, yet the universe operates according to principles that make absolute prediction impossible. And even the smallest unexpected variable can cascade into consequences that were completely unforeseeable when you made your original plans. The future does not announce itself in advance. It arrives already formed, and you must constantly adjust your understanding of what is possible based on information you did not have yesterday. This is not merely an inconvenience or a minor frustration that can be solved with better planning tools or more detailed spreadsheets, because the uncertainty itself is not a flaw in our predictive systems, but rather a fundamental feature of how reality operates at every level. Physics itself tells us that certainty about the future is impossible, that probability and chance are woven into the fabric of existence, and yet we continue to operate as though the future is a knowable thing that we can control if we are simply disciplined enough or intelligent enough or careful enough. We invest enormous amounts of mental energy in trying to secure the future, to lock it down, to make it safe and predictable, yet this future refuses to be secured, and despite having this knowledge, despite understanding intellectually that uncertainty is inevitable, we persist in the fantasy that our next year or our next decade can somehow be different, that we can somehow escape the fundamental unpredictability that governs everything. We make plans as though the future is a fixed destination that we are traveling toward, when in reality every moment is a branching point where infinite possibilities collapse into whatever actually occurs, and we simply have to accept that we are living in a perpetual state of incomplete information, constantly reacting to developments we did not foresee and could not have foreseen. The disturbing part is not merely that the future is uncertain, but that we have built entire lives, entire civilizations, entire systems of meaning and purpose around the assumption that it is not, that security is possible, that control is achievable, and that if we just follow the right path or make the right choices, everything will work out the way we hoped it would. And so we are forced to live in the gap between what we believe should be true and what actually is true, constructing meaning and purpose not despite the uncertainty, but somehow within it. Finding that the only real security available to us is not the elimination of uncertainty, but rather the development of resilience in the face of it, the capacity to adapt and rebuild when the future arrives as something entirely different from what we imagined. Perhaps this is why the most functional people are not those who eliminate uncertainty through rigid planning, but those who develop a kind of comfortable relationship with the unknown, who can hold their intentions lightly while remaining committed to their values, understanding that the future will always surprise them, and that this surprise is not a betrayal of their efforts, but simply the texture of being alive in a world that exceeds our capacity to control it. The person who can watch their carefully laid plans dissolve without experiencing it as a personal failure has discovered something closer to freedom than any amount of certainty could ever provide, because they have stopped confusing their ability to predict with their ability to live well. And in that surrender, they find a kind of groundedness that no forecast or projection could ever offer. Consider the peculiar experience of living through any given moment, where you find yourself in the middle of an ordinary day, perhaps sitting at a desk or walking through a familiar place, and you suddenly become aware that the moment you are experiencing is already dissolving into the past before you can fully grasp it. The present, that thin slice of time where you are actually alive and conscious and capable of experiencing sensation, exists for such an infinitesimally brief duration that by the time your brain processes what is happening, the moment has already transitioned into memory, into history, into something that no longer exists in the realm of lived experience. You reach for the present moment the way you might reach for water in a river, and it flows through your fingers before your hand closes, leaving you always slightly behind your own existence, always chasing a moment that recedes faster than you can perceive it. Even this sentence you are reading now, even these very words entering your consciousness, are already part of the past by the time you understand them, by the time their meaning settles into your awareness, and this creates a strange temporal paradox where the only time you ever truly perceive anything is retrospectively, through the filter of reflection and memory rather than through direct immediate experience. The mechanism behind this phenomenon is fundamentally rooted in how human consciousness and neurology function, in how the brain requires a measurable duration to process sensory information and translate it into conscious awareness. And this processing delay means that you are always experiencing a delayed version of reality rather than reality as it occurs. Your perception of the present is not simultaneous with the present itself, but rather arrives milliseconds later, and while milliseconds seem insignificant, they compound across the entire duration of your life to create the unsettling truth that you never actually live in the present moment, but rather in a perpetual, infinitesimal past. Furthermore, human attention is a limited resource that can only focus on a narrow band of experience at any given time, which means that even if you could somehow perceive the present instantaneously, you would still only be aware of a tiny fraction of what is actually happening both in your environment and within your own body, leaving vast portions of your present experience completely unexamined and unwitnessed by your conscious mind. The present moment, therefore, is not merely fleeting, but is also fundamentally inaccessible to full conscious awareness. And what you call the present is really a constructed narrative that your brain assembles from fragments of sensory data and memory, a story about what is happening rather than a direct perception of it. Yet despite understanding this quite basic truth about the structure of consciousness and time, despite knowing logically that the present continuously slips away and that you can never actually inhabit it fully, humans continue to behave as though they have unlimited time, and as though they can defer the business of actual living to some future moment that will never materially arrive any differently than this one has. People postpone experiences, relationships, expressions of affection, and meaningful actions with the assumption that there will be another moment, another day, another year to accomplish these things, all while the present continues its relentless slide into past, and this strange contradiction between knowledge and behavior persists throughout human existence without resolution. The slipping away of the present is perhaps the most fundamental source of human anxiety and regret, yet it remains largely unexamined in everyday discourse, and we have normalized this temporal imprisonment to such a degree that it barely registers as unusual, even though it is the defining characteristic of conscious existence. Consider the moment you wake up in the morning and immediately begin constructing the narrative of your day, assigning significance to tasks that are ultimately arbitrary collections of movements and decisions that hold no inherent weight in the universe. Yet you convince yourself that finishing your work, maintaining your relationships, or achieving your goals matters in some fundamental way that transcends mere biological survival, and this construction happens so automatically, so seamlessly woven into the fabric of your consciousness, that you rarely pause to recognize that you are actively manufacturing the very significance that drives your behavior and shapes your emotional responses to events that would otherwise simply occur without meaning attached to them. The mechanism underlying this construction is rooted in how human consciousness operates fundamentally as a meaning-making machine, a biological system that evolved not to perceive reality as it objectively exists, but rather to interpret reality through frameworks that allowed our ancestors to survive and reproduce. And this interpretive machinery cannot help but assign meaning to experiences because meaning is the language through which our brains organize information and create coherence from the chaos of raw sensory data. So that when you experience something, your mind immediately asks what it means for you, what its significance is, whether it threatens or benefits your survival, and this questioning creates narrative structures around events that would otherwise be neutral occurrences. What makes this particularly unsettling is the realization that the meaning you assign to nearly everything in your life is constructed through learned frameworks inherited from your culture, your family, your religion, your social group, and these frameworks feel as though they are discovering pre-existing truths about significance, when in reality they are imposing interpretation onto a universe that contains no meaning whatsoever outside of what conscious beings choose to assign to it. And yet we have normalized this state of affairs so completely that to suggest meaning is constructed rather than discovered feels almost offensive, as though questioning the validity of someone's meaning-making enterprise represents an attack on their personhood, when perhaps it is simply an acknowledgement of how human consciousness actually works. The persistence of this illusion, despite our intellectual understanding of it, demonstrates something profound about the architecture of human experience, which is that we cannot function without meaning, we cannot motivate ourselves, we cannot find purpose or direction, we cannot experience beauty or connection or love without the constructed frameworks of significance that we have layered onto the world, and this means that meaning, despite being constructed rather than objective, is not less real in its effects on your life, not less powerful in its capacity to move you emotionally or inspire you to action. And perhaps this is the most disturbing truth of all, that your entire life structure, everything that motivates you, every goal you pursue and every dream you harbor, rests upon this foundation of constructed meaning that you know is constructed, and yet cannot help but treat as though it were eternally true and independently real. And perhaps this is precisely where you find yourself now, simultaneously aware that the meaning you construct is arbitrary and utterly unable to live as though it were, caught in the paradox of a consciousness that must believe in its own fictions to survive them, which suggests that the construction of meaning is not a flaw in human existence, but rather its defining feature, the mechanism by which a meaningless universe becomes, for you, meaningful. This is why the constructed meaning of a single conversation with a friend can sustain you through weeks of difficulty, why a self-imposed creative project can feel more vital than biological necessity, why you can find profound significance in a moment that objectively contains nothing but light and sound and the presence of another purse. Consider the athlete who trains through pain, the artist who sacrifices comfort for their craft, the parent who endures sleepless nights and emotional exhaustion to raise their children, the student who pushes through frustration and self-doubt to master a difficult subject. In each case, something meaningful emerges only on the other side of considerable struggle, and this pattern is so consistent across human experience that we rarely question whether it might be otherwise. The disturbing truth is that purpose and suffering appear to be fundamentally intertwined in ways that go far beyond mere coincidence or unfortunate circumstance. When we examine the lives of people who report the greatest sense of meaning and direction, we find without exception that their purpose was forged through difficulty, loss, challenge, and sustained discomfort. The single mother working multiple jobs finds purpose in providing for her children, but only by enduring financial stress and physical exhaustion. The scientist makes breakthrough discoveries by spending years in failure and rejection before achieving success. The musician develops mastery only by practicing through boredom, frustration, and the pain of repeated mistakes. This mechanism appears to operate on a psychological level where the effort itself becomes inseparable from the value we assign to the goal. When something comes easily, we tend to dismiss it as trivial or unimportant, but when something demands sacrifice and persistence, we naturally invest it with greater significance and meaning. Our brains seem calibrated to recognize that genuine accomplishment requires overcoming resistance, and without that resistance, achievement feels hollow and undeserving of our commitment. The paradox deepens when we consider that humans actively seek out suffering in the pursuit of purpose. We choose difficult careers over comfortable ones, we volunteer for challenging responsibilities, we set goals we know will stretch us to our limits. We do this not because we are masochistic, but because we intuitively understand that a life without struggle tends toward emptiness and aimlessness. The most troubling aspect of this relationship is how thoroughly it has become normalized and even celebrated in our culture. We build narratives around suffering as noble, as redemptive, as the price of meaningful existence. We tell young people that they must suffer to succeed, that pain is the payment for purpose, that comfort is the enemy of growth. And perhaps most disturbingly, we have become so accustomed to this arrangement that we rarely stop to question whether suffering is truly necessary or whether we have simply constructed a world in which it appears to be inevitable. The system perpetuates itself not through external force, but through our internalized acceptance that this is simply how meaningful life must work. Yet this raises a crucial question. If we removed the suffering, would the purpose remain, or have we confused the obstacle with the objective itself? We may have organized our entire understanding of meaning around a limitation that was never actually necessary, but simply became self-reinforcing once we accepted it as inevitable. Perhaps the most revealing experiment would be to imagine a society that had deliberately constructed meaning through other mechanisms, through beauty, connection, discovery, or creation pursued for their own sake, and consider whether such a society would be any less purposeful or simply purposeful in ways we have forgotten how to recognize. The question haunts us precisely because we cannot easily answer it. We have organized too much of our identity and social structure around the redemptive power of struggle to imagine alternatives clearly, and perhaps that blindness itself is the deepest way suffering has become woven into our sense of purpose. Yet what if this blindness serves a function? What if a culture that too easily imagined purposeful lives without struggle would lose the very motivation that drives growth, sacrifice, and the hard-won achievements that give human existence its texture and meaning? Consider the person who has spent years fighting against a reality that refuses to change, who has exhausted themselves through resistance to circumstances beyond their control, who has created suffering not from the situation itself, but from the ceaseless internal struggle against it, and who one day simply stops struggling and finds that the weight they carried lifts almost immediately without the external situation changing at all. This is the paradox of acceptance, and it reveals something fundamental about human consciousness that we often overlook in our relentless pursuit of control. When we accept a difficult reality, we are not surrendering to defeat or abandoning our values. Rather, we are redirecting the energy we once spent on denial and resistance toward understanding, adaptation, and genuine problem solving. The psychological mechanism operates through a deceptively simple principle. The mind creates suffering not merely through exposure to pain, but through the friction between what is and what we believe should be. And when we collapse that distance by accepting what is, the friction dissolves even if the circumstance remains unchanged. A person with chronic illness who battles against their condition experiences constant anguish, but the moment they accept the reality of their illness while still working toward healing, a strange peace emerges because they have stopped asking the impossible question of why this happened to them and have instead begun asking what they can do within this new reality. This acceptance does not mean happiness or contentment with suffering. It means releasing the secondary layer of pain that comes from rejection and resistance, from the exhausting work of pretending reality is different than it actually is. We persist in our resistance despite understanding this truth, because acceptance requires a kind of death to our ego, a surrender of the narrative we have constructed about how our lives should unfold, and this feels unbearable even though the actual liberation that follows is unmistakably real and accessible to anyone willing to release their grip on how things must be. Yet paradoxically, this release of control, this willingness to say this is how it is, and I can still move forward, often unleashes a clarity and resourcefulness that our desperate grip on how things should be had obscured, revealing that acceptance and effective action are not opposites but intimate partners in the creation of a life marked by resilience and genuine peace. The person who accepts their financial limitations and builds a meaningful life within them often discovers more genuine satisfaction than the person who perpetually resents their circumstances while remaining paralyzed. And this is because peace is not a function of external abundance, but of internal alignment, of finally allowing yourself to want what you actually have rather than eternally wanting what you do not. This alignment is not passive resignation but active reconciliation, a deliberate choice to stop hemorrhaging energy through the wound of resistance, and instead to direct that recovered vitality toward building something meaningful within the constraints of reality as it actually exists, which is perhaps why those who have learned this lesson often radiate a quiet strength that no amount of external circumstance can diminish. And this is observable everywhere we look. The artist who accepts their modest audience and creates freely experiences more joy than the celebrated artist still chasing validation. The aging person who accepts their changing body and adapts their life accordingly moves through the world with more grace than the one perpetually at war with time itself. Acceptance, properly understood, is not the end of striving but the beginning of striving from a place of wholeness rather than a place of desperate lack. This is why the greatest paradox of acceptance is that it often precedes our most meaningful transformations. We cannot genuinely change what we refuse to acknowledge, and the person who finally accepts "I am afraid," or "I have failed," or "I cannot do this alone" suddenly pass.